It's been almost 3 years since millions of us raised our hands and voices to say Me Too.
Since then, we've seen incredible strides and experienced some amazing wins. We've also learned that we have so much farther to go to bring about the change we need to see.
We launched the Survivors Agenda to center what survivors in this country care about so we can build the kind of world we all deserve.
As a survivor and an attorney who has dedicated my career to seeking justice, the thing that I most want to see is institutions take survivors seriously and develop the systems that allow for justice and for healing.
As a survivor, the things that I care about most are ensuring that all survivors are heard and supported, no matter their zip code, immigration status, ethnicity, or any other reason.
There's power in our numbers, and an end to sexual violence needs all of us.
We are resourceful, resilient, and ready.
Welcome to day 2 of the Survivor Summit. We are grateful for your participation, your bravery, and your tenacity. As you will hear throughout the next 2 days, this summit is truly about you. This summit is about the critical need to place survivors at the center of the decision-making process, to make survivors powerful, and to devise survivor-driven solutions that will end sexual harassment and violence in the workplace and in our communities. Yesterday, you heard from a powerhouse panel, including Fatima Goss-Graves, President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, Monica Ramirez, founder and president of Justice for Migrant Women, the Anita Hill, chair of the Hollywood Commission, Prentice Hemphill of the Black Embodiment Initiative and host of Finding Our Way, and Brianna Braveheart, an Indigenous youth activist. Today is all about diving into the core issues of the Survivors Agenda and building the skills we need to fight for the world that we want to see. Today's breakout sessions will include tips for creating a workplace where you thrive and bullies don't, a survivor-centered doula care, a conversation about race, sexual violence, and the future of the restorative justice movement, advocating for survivor-supportive policies despite the harmful new Title IX rule, digging up the roots of child sexual abuse, and making the discussion of survivors inclusive of people with disabilities. You should refer to your program for a description of each session, the list of speakers, and how to join. So go forth and enjoy day 2 of the Survivor Summit. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi to everyone virtually attending the Survivor Summit. My name is Lark Lewis, and I am here to show support for all of the survivors watching and participating in the summit. This is such a powerful and much needed space for anyone who has experienced sexual violence. Every single person deserves to live a life where they feel safe, loved, and protected, and that is exactly what the Survivor Summit is starting to create.
Welcome to our movement building session at the Survivor Summit. We're so honored to have you with us. My name is Takeda Mitchell, she, her pronouns, and I'm the program director at Me Too International. And I'm honored to be here with my co-conspirators, Raya and Shireen, for a powerful session on movement building. For the next 50 minutes, we're going to share our stories of power and resilience, discuss movement and movement building, and highlight ways for all of us to get involved in the fight to end sexual violence. Raya and Shireen, can you all tell us a little bit more about yourselves? Can you share your pronoun, your organization, and how did you join the Survivor Justice Movement?
My name is Raya Steyer. My pronouns are they, them, and I am representing Equality Labs. I am an activist. I'm also a lawyer, and I kickstarted the Me Too movement in South Asia in 2017, right when the Me Too movement gained traction in the US with the accusations against Harvey Weinstein. I thought it was a good moment to also kickstart it in other parts of the world where sexual violence and a hostile workplace is commonplace. So that's how I got involved in the survivor justice movement.
Hi, Nikita. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, an honor to be here with you and me too. I use she, her pronouns. My name's Shireen Alamzadeh, and I'm the co-founder and co-director of Healing to Action. We are a survivor-led organization based in Chicago, and our mission is to end gender-based violence by building the leadership and collective power of the communities most impacted. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our work later on, but in terms of what got me involved in the survivor justice movement, well, I've been working on this pretty much my whole life, my whole career. I am the daughter, I come from a family of survivors, and I have definitely felt the generational impact of that trauma on my body and on my relationships. And so it's something that's deeply personal to me. It's also just something that from the very beginning gave me life to see how incredibly powerful and resilient that survivors are. They've inspired me in my own personal family and in my in all of the relationships that I have. So that's really how I got here. That's a little bit of the backstory.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, for being vulnerable and open. One of the things that really resonated with me when you were talking was about like being from a family of survivors and being called into the work from the very beginning. Like I too identify as a survivor and have been a part of whether it be racial justice movements or ending police brutality, but there's something about going back to the experience that have shaped my entire life and being like, how do I join a movement, a community that is committed to protecting that little girl inside of me, right? And so super appreciate you sharing that, that inspiration. And I know that might resonate with a lot of folks here who have joined the summit with us. So we're gonna be talking a lot about movement. We're gonna be using that word. Can you define what is a movement? What is the survivor justice movement? What do we mean when we say that word?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't have a textbook answer. Sorry. One day we can write a textbook about it. But I think for me, it's really about being a survivor is such a personal experience. It's such a personal identity that people hold, and it's also a really lonely one, or has been traditionally a really lonely identity. There's a lot of stigma and shame and blame that's attached to it. And so I think for me, what it means to build a movement for survivor justice is to start to build a collective story and a collective identity around survivorship, and really reclaiming it as a source of power, as a source of transformation, as a source of wisdom in our communities. So I think movement, obviously movement, a lot of times when you think of movements, you think about a huge group of people amassing together to protest or to, hold an institution accountable. And that's definitely one piece of what I think a survivor movement should look like. But there's another piece, which is creating that shared story and starting to really break people out of that isolation and feeling like what happened to them is a result of a personal choice that they made, which so many survivors view experiences of trauma that way, or because of a relationship, or because they didn't get along with somebody, or because of even personal circumstances like personal identity, sort of identities that people hold that might make them feel more vulnerable to violence. All of that is, of course, a part of the story, but the full shared story is so much clearer when you're talking to other survivors, when you're in community with other survivors, when you're sharing these threads that bring together your stories. So I really think for me, movement is about collective identity and storytelling, and using that collective shared identity that's so lacking for so many people into action, moving that into action.
Couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. One of the things that come to mind is 3 years ago when folks said Me Too. And I remember sitting in front of my computer and seeing people that I've known my entire life say Me Too. And me being like, wow, wow, I am, even though I understand logically that I'm not alone. I understand logically that what happened to me was not my fault. Well, that took a while to get there, right? But I understand now that it wasn't my fault, that there are larger systems at play that enable sexual violence in our homes and our communities. It really unlocks something when neighbors and friends and family also said, this is my experience too. And we're searching and yearning for connection in a way that silence oftentimes doesn't allow us to do, right? A culture of silence doesn't allow for us to do. And so, and how we take that into action, absolutely. And we've been seeing some beautiful action taking place. We've been seeing folks in movement, organizing, seeking change. And so I would love to hear, like, how has your organization been working to build and advance the movement to end sexual violence? What are some of those victories that y'all have been a part of and inside of?
Yeah, thank you for asking, and thank you for sharing. That was really powerful. So I'm happy to share a little bit more about Healing to Action, a little bit about our history. So we grew out of a coalition of rape crisis centers, worker centers, legal aid organizations, and other allied organizations. We've been working together for about 8 years in this group of allies across Chicago. We started in about 2012, and it was really initially about coming together and addressing the high rates of sexual violence in the workplace, particularly in low-wage workplaces. And we saw this need for more collaboration, particularly across the labor movement and the movement to end sexual violence in Chicago. And so we spent years really hashing out what should this look like, educating each other, working with survivors in both movements to try to figure out a collective vision for moving forward. And what we learned from survivors that we were working with is that what was really missing was a space for survivors, not just to discuss the issues, not just to educate themselves or to gain information or access to resources, but really to build power together. So really trying to develop leadership skills so they could talk about this issue in their communities, create a shared vision for what change could look like, and just really organize towards that change. So setting that vision and then moving into action. So that's how Healing to Action was born. We were founded in 2016 out of this call to action from survivors. And we, at the inception of the organization, we spent over a year talking with survivors from communities that are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence in Chicago. So the communities that we focus on specifically are low income, Black and Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, undocumented, disabled, and LGBTQ survivors. And so those were some of the communities that we were the most involved with from the beginning, to really get their ideas around what leadership should look like and what skills they needed and they identified as necessary to become leaders in their community, to really speak out on these issues. And so we spent about a year meeting with survivors across the city from different neighborhoods, from different workplaces and industries, speaking different languages. And through those conversations and through that work together, we designed our leadership program, Healing Generations, which launched in 2018. And we've now offered that twice, and we have a base of about 30 leaders who come from many of the communities that I just identified and speak many different languages, and all have really different experiences as survivors. But together they have really built this shared idea and analysis of what causes gender-based violence and what causes sexual violence. And so the Survivor Leadership Program is one piece. We combine healing justice with education about the root causes. So we talk a lot about white supremacy, about capitalism, about other kinds of injustice to really understand and ground sexual violence in a bigger framework. We also talk to folks about skill building and how they can speak about these issues effectively with people that they love who may disagree with them, how they can safely intervene to support survivors that are experiencing harm, how to receive information, how to receive disclosures from survivors when people that trust them and that they care for tell them that this has happened to them. And then the last piece is that we actually work to design campaigns that our leaders work on. They decide what they want to work on based on their experiences and their wisdom and understanding of what is causing sexual violence in their communities based on their experiences. So our first leadership cohort actually launched a campaign. It's been going for about 1.5 years now. It's called Sex Ed Works. And they had a whole conversation in the leadership program about how they were learning about a lot of concepts like consent and healthy relationships and what that means for the first time as adults in this program, and that they didn't have access to sexual health education, and they felt like if they had, maybe this would not have happened to them, and they wanted to make sure that their children received access to that education. And they learned after talking with their kids that they weren't receiving this education at all in school, even though there is a mandatory comprehensive sexual health education policy in Chicago, and schools are supposed to be teaching it. So we did a lot of digging and research and really launched this campaign publicly last year to start to try to ensure that the school district was going to be offering the access to this really important critical education to students, particularly in the communities that are hardest hit by sexual violence, the communities that our leaders were coming from, that have been underinvested or disinvested in from many different institutions in our city. So that is the Sex Ed Works campaign. And it's really just one example of the magic that can happen when survivors have a space for their vision, have a space for their ideas, and there aren't just decisions that are being made for them. Through the campaign, our leaders have been able to hold people in power accountable. They've met with school board leaders. They have held town halls. They've written letters. They are, talking with people in their community. They've reached over 250 community members through organizing, community meetings and teach-ins and listening sessions. They've been partnering with the Chicago Teachers Union. So this is just one small example about what survivor-led organizing can look like. And I think what we really feel proud about with our organizing work at Healing to Action is that it's really being led by the hearts and the minds and the desires of survivors. So in that way, we see our work as really giving power back so that people can really self-determine their futures and build the world they want to see, and use their experiences of survival as a key building block to do that.
Thank you for sharing all of those amazing victories that have come from the desires and yearnings of survivors. One of the things that you named that I'm sitting with is this concept of power and leadership, right? And so for some of us, those concepts of having agency, having voice, being able to determine what you want, what you need, what you don't want, being able to say no and yes, all of those concepts for some of us have been a struggle to lean into, a struggle to believe that you have power and that you should determine what's best for you and your community. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about the work and how power and leadership and consent is key to the work that y'all are doing and building power for the work towards the world that y'all want to build. And so very beautiful to hear that come out of your work. The thing that I'm super curious about is you keep talking about vision, right? And we know that vision is critical for movements, because a vision is what we aspire to. It is what holds us and grounds us when it gets hard, when we believe it's not possible, right? Vision allows for us to come back to what we desire. And so I'm really curious about, from you all's perspective and at Healing to Action, but also just in general in terms of the survivor justice movement, what would that world look like without sexual violence? what would exist in our communities and in our homes? What are we fighting for, Shireen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, everyone, it is a collective question. So I can't speak for the entire movement, but I can share my own sort of thoughts and my vision. And I think we do spend a lot of time at Healing to Action visioning together, because part of the work really requires radical imagination, you know, and really thinking about a future that's bold, ambitious, and really difficult to really envision when there's the root causes of sexual violence are so deeply embedded in our culture and our society. So it can be really hard to break past that. And sometimes people can feel hopeless about, like, why am I even thinking about this? But it is the energizing force, you know, and if you're not thinking big and bold, then what are you really doing? You know, why are you in this work? The work is too hard not to have a big, bold vision behind it. But for me, I think that when I think about what sexual violence is, I think about it as a tool to police people and to enforce conformity and to enforce certain behaviors based on assumptions that people have about each other when they're in the womb, you know, before they're even born. Assumptions about who they should love, what they should wear, how they should act, what kind of work they should do, you know, what kind of sex they should have, all of this, right? And so for me, really, what a world free from sexual violence is a world that is so much bigger and freer for people to come with so many more options at their disposal, where they can be their freest and their most authentic selves, you know, that they can make these choices without this threat of violence that is hanging over them all the time if they choose to step out of line, if they choose to break out of the box of conformity. And so to me, it's a world where kids can play with whatever toys they want to play with, you know, where people can be in relationships with whoever they love and is meaningful to them, that people can set a vision for their future and how they're going to bring meaning into their lives that isn't constrained by expectations that are grounded in things like their sex organs or their sex assigned at birth. And it's a world that just feels like the air is clearer and the sun is brighter, and everything is just more possible. The things that are so meaningful to us, the relationships that we hold, the work that gives us joy, the family that gives us meaning, the community that we care about, all of that becomes more accessible to us and more open to us.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for sharing your vision around what the world and what our communities need to look like in order to not exist under sexual violence and patriarchal violence. Raya, I would love to pass it to you to answer the same question. What does the world look like without sexual violence? What would need to exist to make that possible?
I think we need to end the culture of impunity that exists in our society. So in South Asia, where I did most of my gender justice work, there is a deep culture of impunity that perpetrators and harm doers enjoy, and that is reinforced through the courts, and it's reinforced through the family, and it's reinforced through like our neighbors and our society in general. And a world without sexual violence would make sure that that doesn't exist, that culture of impunity is dismantled, and that we try to create safe spaces for ourselves in small like bubbles, but in an ideal world, every place should be a safe space for women, for non-men, for queer people. It should be a safe space no matter where we go, and we don't have to create one in our like private spaces.
Agree. The ways in which culture and societal systems enable, support, endorse sexual violence must be uprooted in order for us to have a world where that doesn't exist. The question or the theme that's coming up for me is a question of deserving, right? We as survivors deserve the world that y'all just named. We deserve a world that doesn't doesn't stand up around isn't built on patriarchal violence, right? We deserve a world where there's access to justice and accountability that's transformative. And we also deserve healing throughout. Yeah. And hopefully throughout the folks are receiving the permission to dream of that world, right? Giving yourself that permission to have a radical imagination and believe just a little bit more that it's possible to get to that world. The other thing that's coming to mind, and Shireen, you talked about this a little bit, which is that sexual violence is a form of control and domination, right? Both culturally and societal structures. And in this moment, we're also talking about control and domination of another type, which is police violence, right? The criminal justice system, the immigration system, the ways in which our bodies are being impacted by state-based terror. And so the question that comes to mind for me is, how does that relate to the survivor justice movement? And so if y'all don't mind answering, and Raya, I'll pass it to you first. If we understand that survivors are everywhere, that oftentimes we're also survivors of other forms of oppression, whether it be caste oppression, whether it be police brutality, racism, poverty, homophobia, transphobia. If we also understand that there are movements that do work in those areas, can you share why might it be important for other movements to know about and center the needs of survivors of sexual violence? And what might that look like in practice?
I think that when it comes to police violence or, caste atrocities that impact my community, for example, and, my community is also really impacted by police killings. And I believe that people who are impacted by these atrocities are survivors in the end of the day. And sexual violence, those who go through sexual violence are also survivors of, this control that people in power try to assert over you to perpetuate, patriarchy or any other form of oppression that is systemic. So I feel that survivors in general need to link up, regardless of, what the type of oppression was. So survivors of police brutality and survivors of, sexual violence do have things in common in that we're trying to dismantle these systems that, perpetuate this kind of harm on survivors and create survivors in the first place. So I think it's important to center survivors of gender justice in conversations about police brutality, because often the police also assault, there are a lot of custodial sexual violence and sexual violence in prisons. So I think it is very pertinent to discuss that aspect of violence when we talk about, police brutality or any other kind of violence. The sexual violence is always an aspect of control, even in different other types of brutalities that take place. So I think it's important to center that.
Absolutely. Shireen, anything you would add?
I think Raya summed it up very well. I think that, the other piece around why it's important to, and I would even go so far to say hold other movements accountable to the desires and the needs of survivors, is because the solutions without the voices of survivors simply don't respond to their realities. So just an example to the point of police brutality is, when I've asked survivors within our membership base, people have very different opinions about whether the police are helpful in situations of trauma and harm that are happening based on their experiences with the police, based on their communities, their identities, their lived experiences. And so I think that it's both, it's kind of goes both ways, because one, you need to hold other social justice movements accountable. So one example I can give there is that Healing to Action works a lot with the economic justice and labor movement. And we will do trainings all the time. We've done trainings with unions and worker centers and labor alliances across the country where the leadership doesn't necessarily know that this is an issue, and you go and start talking about it, and almost everybody in the room starts to share that this is something that's happened to them, and also share that they didn't know that this was a place that was for sharing this kind of thing, you know, and that this is not an institution that is where they felt safe talking about it. And so how do we create the conditions where our institutions, our social movement organizations are responding to what survivors are wanting and needing for them to do? Because as you said so beautifully, Nikita, survivors are everywhere, you know, so it's not about responding to the needs, it's recognizing that survivors are you. It's your organization. You know, you are working, you owe survivors because they are doing so much work for you to advance your goals. But with respect, just one last thought, with respect to the issues around police violence and police brutality, I think, you know, it was really powerful to have a group of survivors together sharing the very different experiences that they had with police. We had survivors from some of Chicago's neighborhoods where there's very heavy police presence talking about how police are just not trained to deal with mental health trauma that a lot of people in their communities were dealing with, and that they didn't have those resources. And so police were creating more violence and harm as a result of their presence in their communities, while other survivors with disabilities were talking about how police intervention and interpersonal violence can often lead to institutionalization, where they're being put into institutions. And then undocumented survivors talking about how they felt like the police didn't understand the family situations that they were in, and were responding in really culturally insensitive ways to some of the issues that they were raising. But to have everyone together in that room and saying, look, you know, this is my experience, this is my story. It was really, really powerful for people to hear from one another, so they could really start to deconstruct what the police means in a much more in-depth, kind of nuanced way than they would have been able to if they didn't have that space to build relationships and share stories together.
So we talked about what a movement is. We talked about what the visions are of survivors, our own visions, and why we think that that's important. A movement is built on the power and the leadership and the collective brilliance of survivors, right? At least this particular movement, that it takes all of us. Yeah, it will take all of us. And so I'm curious, what would you all share as one way for folks attending this summit? How can they join the movement to end sexual violence? If they're committed, if they care about this work, how can they show up?
I think those who are interested in helping, you know, who are interested in, you know, taking this movement forward and building this movement, I think it's important for them to join organizations and people who are already doing this work and offering their services and help to these organizations and people doing this work already, and kind of helping them build capacity to grow. I think it's, you know, there are already people doing this work, and it's really important to support them and to learn from them and to kind of spread what they're doing elsewhere and to build capacity. So I think it's really important for people who are interested in doing this kind of work to kind of work with them, work with the people already doing this work, and kind of building on that. I think it's really important for us to kind of, you know, take what is already there and then build on that.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, to Raya's point, I think also that people who are, if you're watching, you've already taken one step, you know, and these are organizations. We're very grateful to be a part of this summit, and we're very grateful to the organizers. And these are all organizations that you should check out, because the purpose for our existence is to support survivors to lift up their experiences and voices. So I can share, for Healing to Action, you can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, healingtoaction.org. I know that you all might want to also share some of your information, but I think, it's really not about, I think one of the things, as we talked about earlier, Nikita, was this idea that it's such big, like ambitious kind of goals that we have, that it can feel like you can feel paralyzed or you can feel like frozen into action, because it's just such a big and lofty goal. But like just doing things like showing up, you should feel proud of doing that, and also being really confident and secure in your experience and the wisdom and power that you bring to this, that your voice is so important, your presence is so important. And so in the small and large ways that you can get involved in this work, feel very good about doing it, and know that you have our support and our admiration for doing it.
I think the thing that's coming up for me from both what y'all said is, if you have taken the time to register for this event, to watch this session, to be in your healing journey, to sit when you get triggered or feel fear, to lean into joy and laughter, you are a part of this movement to end sexual violence. You are a part of this community that is committed to ensuring that we're in a world where this is not our future. And so I was deeply grateful for you all's commitment and you all's joining in of this movement. Want to also share, we are building a survivor's agenda. And so you can also join this community as well, whether it be looking at the agenda, sharing your agenda with us at survivorsagenda.org, following up with amazing organizations that have been in this session, whether it be Healing to Action, Equality Labs, or other organizations throughout the summit, or just being in community in your own home, in your own family, with yourself in terms of your story. So thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us for the last hour, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikita. Thank you.
Thank you.
What would happen if a woman told the truth about her life? Wrapped up in her torment, she'd be vulnerable to a world of eyes, peeling her skin by skin as she opens up on all her layers of self, the ones spoken and unspoken, while we gaze and wonder how she's still alive, how she opens up to a world of judgment, how she's strong, how she knows, how she breathes in the world for what it is, and then finally speaks. I will live.
Hi, I'm Teresa.
My name is Bronwyn Bedrick, and I'm an OBGYN.
My name is Ashley Farrell-Palmer.
My name is Jordan.
Hi, my name is Samantha McCoy.
And Carrie. My name is Jackie, and I rise because I aspire to support survivors so that we may thrive together.
I rise in order to ensure that survivors across the country are able to find their justice and have their voices heard.
Because I took a vow to provide for my patients. And for me, that means working to ensure their basic medical and legal rights.
And I rise because all survivors deserve their rights.
I rise because hope is truly contagious. The idea that I have the ability to prevent the next generation of victims in Tennessee from enduring the same hardships that I have is what pushes me forward in my fight for civil rights.
Because survivors deserve to be heard, and changes in our system are necessary in order to adequately respond to sexual assault survivors.
I rise because I believe that justice, healthcare, safety, comfort, and healing should be absolutely guaranteed rights for survivors, no matter who you are and no matter where you live.
Here at Rise, each of us come to this work for a different reason, but we believe that each reason has a place in the Survivors Agenda. We are so proud to be a part of the Survivors Agenda to help shape a better future for us all.
I'm speaking to the girl who is like me walking out of the hospital. I'm speaking to the guy who may not know where to go after his assault. I'm speaking to women, men, girls, boys, whatever you identify as. And I want you to know, you will make it through. Because no matter who you are, where you are, or where you've come from, that you matter. We see you, we believe you, and that we're just getting started.
Hello to the participants of the Survivors Summit. My name is Teresa Younger, and I'm the President and CEO of the Ms. Foundation for Women. I'm thrilled to offer my support to all of you watching. This is a unique and needed space. It is time that we all support the needs of those of us who have experienced sexual violence. At the Ms. Foundation, we believe that we have the answers to help and heal our communities and the power to change the policies to make that happen. And this is our chance. Thank you. We're listening.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. This is #MeToo at School, Advocate advocating for survivor supportive policies despite the harmful new Title IX rule. My name is Naina. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a high school senior from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm on the policy and advocacy team over at Know Your Nine, and I'm going to pass it over to Faith to introduce herself.
I'm Faith Ferber. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a survivor of sexual and domestic violence. I'm a student engagement organizer with Know Your Nine, and I'm currently based in New Jersey.
My name's Maha Ibrahim. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a women's and girls gender civil rights attorney at Equal Rights Advocates out in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Tang. My pronouns are she, her. I have experienced sexual assault, and right now I work on sexual assault and Title IX. I'm an attorney at the National Women's Law Center based in Washington, D.C.
We are super excited to be panelists for this session. We're going to start out with Maha giving an overview of Title IX and the new rule. Then I'm going to go next and explain how students can push their schools to support student survivors using loopholes within the new Title IX rule. Elizabeth is then going to take it from me and explain how schools can take other steps to support student survivors beyond just Title IX investigations. And then Faith will explain some of the best practices for student organizing to close us out. So we are going to be using some specific examples to illustrate our points at certain points in the presentation. If that is triggering or if it negatively affects you in any way, you can feel absolutely free to just pause or skip that part, take a step back. I want to note as a high school senior that learning about some of the topics that we're going to cover in this panel can be really intimidating for those of us with no formal legal training. And I know that I am still learning about all of this stuff, and sometimes it's really challenging. But I want to stress that this information is not just for lawyers, and it takes some work for the rest of us to understand, but it can be comprehensible. And it's actually really important that those of us without formal training who are on the ground advocating for survivors in the school setting are able to understand this content. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Maha to give us an overview of Title IX.
Thank you. So I'm going to give an overview of the law, but as was just said, these are your rights. And our job as lawyers isn't to own the rights or hold the rights or be elitist about them. Elizabeth and I and our organizations are here, as well as Know Your Nine, to give you anything you need as you go to understand what your rights are and what you want to do. So if anything is confusing or if I go too fast, we've put our contact information and we'll give you any resource we've got and we'll always be there to lend an ear and be helpful. So Title IX is a federal civil rights law and it protects students from sex discrimination. And sex discrimination includes sexual harassment and violence. As federal civil rights law means that it's a right that your school owes to you. It belongs to you, your school owes it to you. And what they owe you is to make sure that your right to an educational environment free of sex harassment, violence, discrimination is protected. The protection that Title IX was designed to offer is protection against you losing your equitable access to your education. That means the education itself, but also your experience of school shouldn't be blocked or made harder because of the way someone treats you or something someone did to you because of your sex. Sexual harassment means any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. This includes jokes, slurs, catcalling, rumors, pictures, snapping a bra strap. I like to say a good way to think about it if you're ever in a situation and you're wondering if this is sexual harassment is to ask yourself, is what someone is doing making me uncomfortable? And is that because of my sex? Are they doing it because of my sex, or am I uncomfortable because of my sex or my gender identity, etc.? Sexual violence is any physical act committed against someone without their consent. This includes forced kissing, forced sex acts. Of course, it includes rape. Sexual violence is a type of sexual harassment. So when we say sexual harassment throughout this presentation, we mean sexual violence too. Under Title IX, students who report sexual harassment can receive supportive measures from their schools. Supportive measures are ways your school can help you to make sure your access to school is maintained. And those measures include things like academic supports, counseling, being able to retake tests or classes, being able to change your schedule or ask that someone else's schedule is changed. Anything to really help lessen or eliminate any negative effects to your grades, your daily experience at school, your access that might occur because of sex discrimination that you have suffered. So Title IX is a law, and there are rules that the U.S. Department of Education makes that tell schools what they must do in order to follow that law. But these rules are not unchangeable, and they weren't made by Congress. So when different administrations win the presidency and appoint different leaders to the Department of Education, those leaders can try to make new rules and try to shift the rules to sort of make a worldview that they want to see in place. A big part of what the Title IX rules tell schools is what schools have to do if a student reports sexual harassment or assault. And those are the rules we're going to talk about mostly today. Under Title IX, students who report sexual harassment can also receive a school-based investigation for misconduct. And this is the important part. Schools are not investigating a crime. That's not the work of Title IX, and that's not the work of schools. What schools are investigating is whether an act of misconduct occurred under their Title IX related misconduct policies, even if that same act might qualify as a crime. So it's a totally different investigation than, say, a criminal investigation, even if the same act could qualify as a crime. In a Title IX investigation, the person who files the complaint is called a complainant. The person whom the complaint is about or who is responding to the complaint is called a respondent. If after the Title IX investigation, the school decides that the sexual harassment or sexual assault likely happened, they can offer more supportive measures to the complainant or any other kind of help. And they could also choose to punish the respondent. Although Title IX doesn't require punishment, Title IX is not a zero tolerance kind of punitive policy. Although what they do in response to their findings does need to be effective. Under Title IX, effective has really meant helpful supportive measures and a fair investigation into complaints made by students. Now, the work to get the rights we have under Title IX to the place they need to be, which is a strong and rich place based in the real lived experiences of students and student survivors, has been underway basically since Title IX became a law in 1972. There have been wins and there have been setbacks along the way for survivors and advocates for gender equity. Sometimes the wins or setbacks happen in court, sometimes they happen in politics. Right now, in our lifetime, we are in a very important and historic civil rights moment for Title IX, which has been triggered by politics. The Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos issued a new Title IX rule in May 2020. That new rule went into effect just recently, a couple weeks ago, August 14th, 2020. Under the new rule, it is much harder to get helpful supportive measures or a fair investigation, or in some instances, any investigation at all. I'll tell you a little bit about why it's harder, but I want to preview for you that my co-panelists will also share a lot of great ideas and tips for activism and approaches to fight for better policies and better experiences for survivors on campus. Here's how the new Title IX rules tries to force schools to do harmful things when students report sex discrimination. There are three major categories of concern with this new rule. One, ignoring reports. The new rule narrows the incidents that can be investigated under Title IX, and this amounts to trying to force schools to ignore victims who report. Number two, further harm to victims. The new rule in some ways allows and in some ways requires schools to treat victims in ways that risk further harm to them rather than properly protecting them. And three, unfair procedures. The new rules require investigation procedures that thousands of students, advocates, survivors, and legal experts strongly feel are unfair to complainants. I'll elaborate a little bit further on each of these. Again, this is going to be a fast overview, so if you miss something, don't worry. Our organizations are always here. The new rule attempts to get schools to ignore victims in four basic ways. First, the new rule's narrow definition of sexual harassment is more narrow than the definition that applies to even an employee's rights at the school. That means somebody employed by a school is now more protected against sex discrimination under the laws that protect them than a student is under Title IX because of this new, harder definition. The new definition under Title IX requires that an act of harassment needs to happen more than once, even if it is bad enough that we all know once would be enough to really affect a student's access to school. The old rule said it had to either be very bad, severe, or pervasive, happens a lot. The new rule says severe and pervasive, which my co-panelists will further explain. Second, if a student is sexually harassed online by a classmate or teacher and it happens on a non-school platform like Instagram or TikTok, instead of on a school platform like Zoom or Blackboard, then the school must dismiss the Title IX complaint under the new rule. Now, this is just nonsensical. That wasn't the case before. And we all know that it doesn't matter what platform they harass you on. If they're harassing you in TikTok and then you have to see them in Zoom or sit next to them in class, it's going to affect your access to school. The new rule makes these arbitrary delineations between what the school controls and what it doesn't control, what is a school platform and what isn't. Another example, if a student is raped by a classmate at an off-campus apartment or an off-campus fraternity party in a fraternity that's not officially recognized by their university, then the school must dismiss their Title IX complaint under the new rule. Again, this arbitrary geographic delineation. We know it doesn't matter where it happened if you still have to see the people that were involved. One more example. If a student is sexually assaulted by a professor during a study abroad program, the school can't investigate it under Title IX because it didn't happen in the United States. Third, if a student is too afraid to file a complaint while they're at the school, say against a coach or a thesis advisor, an employee or a long-term student like a doctoral student or even a fellow undergrad or fellow high school student, if the person that was harmed waits until they graduate or transfer or otherwise get pushed out or leave school, and then they feel safe enough or otherwise have the fortitude to report, the school cannot investigate. You have to report while you're enrolled to have a right to a Title IX investigation under the new rules. That wasn't the case before. On the same note, if the harmer leaves, graduates, transfers, retires, quits, the school can choose to dismiss the investigation. So if you had a teacher or a coach who did terrible things to many students for many years, and then they just throw up their hands and quit when they're when people are trying to hold them accountable, the school could choose to just drop it and not look into it further. And fourth, the new Title IX rule allows schools to ignore sexual harassment unless it's reported to a very narrow set of school employees. They call these people people with the authority to take corrective action, but they don't define who that is. They say it can be different for every school since schools are so individual, and they don't require that schools tell the students who those people are. So you could think you're reporting to somebody who makes all logical sense, should be responsible to you, and should therefore make the school responsible under Title IX, and it turns out they just weren't on the list. Second, how the new rule can cause further harm to victims. There's three major ways that the school threatens this kind of harm. First, the new Title IX rule allows schools to treat survivors poorly or for the school to be a hot mess in their own processes when you report, as long as they aren't being clearly unreasonable. All these words mean something in the law, and we don't need to sort of suss that out. You don't need to fight that out, but just know that that's ridiculous. For somebody to be clearly unreasonable before they violated your civil right, it's a higher standard than it used to be. And most advocates think it's just wholly unnecessary, and it wasn't put in place at all to help Title IX be a strong law. Second, the new Title IX rule limits the type of supportive measures a school can provide for a survivor. Importantly, it says that the school can't provide supportive measures that are burdensome to the respondent. Well, what if you have classes with the respondent? That would mean that only the survivor can get moved. So in effect, your whole life gets turned upside down for reporting, but they're not allowed to touch the schedule or gym time or field or track time or whatever, the comings and goings of the other party involved. We don't think that's fair. Third, the new Title IX rule allows schools to use a process called mediation to resolve complaints of sexual assault. As a lawyer, let me tell you, there's a lot wrong with mediation in this context, but the big takeaways are this. Mediation is a process that assumes that both sides are at least a little bit at fault. We know that's not the case in sexual harassment and assault. Only one side's at fault. You cannot be at fault for your own sexual harassment or assault. There is nothing you can ever do to warrant that kind of harm. Second, mediation is inappropriate for sexual assault and sexual violence. Mediation is about bringing two parties together to negotiate and make a deal. All the experts, and not just legal experts, but mental health experts, counseling experts, survivor experts, they know that this is just really off base when it comes to sexual assault and violence, and it shouldn't be in these new rules, but it is. The third way, unfair investigation procedures. The new rule requires schools to inform every student who files that there is a presumption of innocence. That means a presumption that the person they're saying hurt them didn't hurt them. That's not required for any other misconduct. If you say somebody hit you, the school doesn't have to perform the whole investigation assuming that you weren't hit. That's a special requirement that's now only in place with sexual harassment and sexual assault allegations, and it's unfair. It can cause a chilling effect on the reporter and make them feel unbelieved from the moment they report. Second, it allows schools to delay their Title IX investigations as long as there's an ongoing criminal investigation. Criminal investigations can take years or months. They have totally different standards. They're looking at totally different questions than school misconduct investigations. And many survivors don't want to file a criminal investigation in lieu of a Title IX investigation. They're looking for, if they file both, or even if it's not their choice because there was mandated reporting involved, another adult had to report to the police. Those two processes are looking at two different outcomes. A school misconduct investigation is about what you need to stay in school and to have equitable access to school. It needs to be prompt, it needs to be fair, and it needs to affect your life at school right now. A criminal investigation is whether somebody committed a crime and whether the state, the government, can take away their liberty. Those are just totally different. One takes a really long time, and to say that they can delay Title IX for a criminal investigation is just incongruous. It just doesn't match up in any way. The new Title IX rules now allow schools to choose between two different standards of evidence. There used to only be one standard of evidence, which was the preponderance of the evidence, which is what the US Department of Education used to suggest schools adopt. Preponderance means more likely than not. It's like a 51%. Now schools can choose between preponderance and clear and convincing. Clear and convincing is much higher. And in interactions between students or in sexual harassment, or sexual assault interactions between an adult and a student or a teacher and a student, that kind of evidence just usually doesn't exist. Again, it's not a criminal process. There's not a police investigation. It's simply a student going to their school and saying, this happened to me and I need assistance. So that's a very dangerous standard, higher standard that schools are now allowed to apply. And fourth, all colleges and universities must conduct live hearings with cross-examination of all parties and witnesses. This means that survivors must be cross-examined by their respondent's advisor, who might be an angry parent, an ex, a fraternity brother. It could be anybody. We have like 5 million reasons why this is super terrible, but I'm sure you can come up with a bunch on your own just now when you heard me say the words live cross-examination. I want to turn it over to my co-panelists who will share solutions and hope and where we can all go together as we fight in this very important civil rights moment. But I'll just say this: live cross-examination has no place in school misconduct proceedings. Schools are not courts, advocates are not lawyers, and even if they are, that could be even worse, to have a trial lawyer conducting cross-examination in a school misconduct hearing. In summary, the new Title IX rule is very dangerous and cruel. The good news is that legal compliance is one thing, one very specific technical thing, but caring about students is a whole different thing. There are still many things students can do to move schools from compliance to care. And my co-panelists are now going to share those insights with you so that you can see how you can fight and do that good work. Lastly, again, just one last thing as a lawyer I want to tell you, and I mean it, I've done this for 5 years. If a school ever tells you they can't work with you, can't meet with you, can't come up with creative solutions with you, can't listen to your ideas, or they listen to your ideas in an infantilizing or dismissive way, and they try to blame the law, or they try to blame their lawyers, or they try to act like you just don't understand, they are lying. I have never once in the 5 years I've practiced this law ever found any example of a school stonewalling student activists with an ounce of legal validity in the claims they were making as to why they couldn't work with those students. So please know you are the experts. If anybody tries to talk down to you or convince you otherwise, they are lying, and you have every right to fight and push forward because, again, this is your right and they owe it to you. With that, I'd like to pass it on to my co-panelist, Faith.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Maha. Before we get to strategies for implementing survivor supportive policies, I just want to touch on again why it's so important that schools have solid policies in place for addressing sexual harassment. So as Maha touched on, there are folks who argue that sexual violence is a crime and thus it should be handled by the police and the criminal legal system and not schools. But again, Title IX is a civil rights law, and that allows schools to do what criminal courts can't to protect your right to an education free from violence. For example, your school can provide you extensions on assignments or a no contact order between you and your perpetrator, while a judge within the criminal legal system can't and won't write you a note excusing you from class or providing other kinds of accommodations like that. And additionally, many people don't feel safe going to the police, especially survivors of color, queer and trans survivors, and undocumented survivors. And those that do report to the police are often re-traumatized by the nature of criminal investigations. So Title IX is an extremely critical alternative to the criminal legal system, especially for survivors who are frequently subjected to state violence. So with that being said, Naina, talk to us about loopholes in the rule and how survivors can use that to our advantage.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maha and Faith. So just to recap, we've talked about why the new rule is so bad, the new rule on Title IX. We've also talked about why Title IX is such an important alternative to the criminal legal system. I'm now going to talk about some loopholes within the new rule that organizers and survivors can use to make its impact less harmful. So loopholes are really important because the new rule from the department is legally binding. So schools have to follow it. And if your school tells you that they are going to ignore any part of the rule, they are lying to you to get you to stop asking them questions and trying to organize. So don't believe that. But the new rule does include some loopholes that students can organize around to push for fairer and more transparent practices on campus. And so by loopholes, I mean that these are places within the rule where schools have a choice between policies that are more harmful and less harmful. And so they can choose that less harmful option and still be in legal compliance with what the rule requires of them. So I'm going to go through a couple of really critical loopholes that you can organize around right now on your campus. And then we'll also link some resources to find more loopholes if you're interested towards the end. So our first one and our most complex one is creating a sexual misconduct policy that exists separately from Title IX. And the reason to do that is to protect a broader base of survivors. So the new rule explicitly has a provision that states that schools are allowed to create their own separate policies that are not tied to Title IX and to the new rule. And these separate policies still can have the power to dictate what kind of complaints of sexual misconduct a school needs to respond to, as well as how they need to respond to those complaints. So this is really critical in relation to the new rule, because now that the scope of Title IX has been weakened by the Department of Education, these separate policies can still be used to make sure that violence that is no longer covered under Title IX still is addressed. And then if it was addressed under these separate policies, it wouldn't be a Title IX complaint, but it would be a complaint under a separate policy that is like specific to the school. So for example, as Maha noted, under the new rule, schools are legally required to dismiss almost all Title IX complaints of off-campus violence. So that is, again, violence that happens during study abroad or in off-campus housing, things like that. But we also know that a lot of the violence that students experience happens in these, off-campus locations, and that it still impacts their access to education, even if that's where it occurs. So although these locations are no longer covered under Title IX, if a school has a separate misconduct policy that does cover off-campus violence, then that policy can be used by survivors who need supportive measures or who need their case investigated instead of Title IX. So again, that separate policy can cover the off-campus violence that Title IX no longer does. And it's not just about location either. So as Maha also noted, the new rule also outlines a very high, very narrow standard for determining what sexual misconduct does and doesn't have to be addressed by schools, again, under Title IX, and that's a really critical piece. So the new Title IX standard put forth by the new rule states that schools only have to address violence that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person equal access to education. And just want to reiterate again, that means that the violence needs to be very bad and it needs to happen a lot. But there's a lot of different types of violence, and things like being catcalled in the hallway, or even experiencing an abusive relationship, what we call intimate partner violence, which is a type of violence that's not very well understood by schools. Those things can be overlooked by schools now, because even though we know that they can really impact educational access, it can be argued that they don't meet this new Title IX standard of the harassment that merits investigation and supportive measures. So a separate process can be really critical for covering these types of violence that are no longer covered by Title IX, because a separate process can impose a standard that is less narrow than the one in the rule. So if a survivor experiences violence that doesn't meet the Title IX standard, they can turn to this other separate policy to get their school to work on their case instead. And one last note on this, the rule says that schools can choose to use a separate process, so again, unrelated to Title IX, to address incidents of harassment or violence that happened before August 14th, 2020, which is when the rule went into effect. So if someone was assaulted during study abroad in February 2020, their school can still choose to investigate their case right now, even though under the new rule, it wouldn't be covered because it happened under study abroad. So in summary of this loophole, student organizers should be pushing their schools to implement a sexual misconduct policy that is separate from Title IX and that covers the violence that Title IX no longer covers. Loophole number 2, supportive measures. So under the new rule, schools can choose to provide supportive measures to survivors no matter what their case status is. But it's not always required of schools. So this is another area where they've got that choice. And we've already talked about supportive measures, but just as a refresher, those are things like extensions on assignments, excused absences from class, access to counseling, other things like that. So under the new rule, even after there's been maybe a dismissal of a case, or maybe a respondent, so a perpetrator, has been found not responsible after an investigation, the complainant or the survivor can still get supportive measures from their school. Schools can still choose to do that. So this is important because there are going to be lots of cases, very valid, legitimate cases, that get dismissed under the new rule because of the exclusion of off-campus violence, because of the narrow standard of harassment. And in those instances, the rule doesn't require schools to provide these supportive measures, but it says that the schools can choose to offer them. So student organizers should push their schools to commit to offering supportive measures in those instances where they have a choice. Loophole number 3, protections for LGBTQ+ students. So the new rule basically leaves protections for trans and gender nonconforming students up in the air. And those students have historically been protected from gender discrimination under Title IX. Gets a little in the weeds here, so bear with me. But there was 2016 guidance, and guidance is different from a rule because it's not legally binding for schools. There was 2016 guidance from the department on the rights of trans and gender nonconforming students, and it had really, really important points like saying that schools should honor the gender pronouns of students, or should make facilities like bathrooms and housing available to students that match their gender identity, no matter what it is. So the department did previously rescind that guidance, which again was never legally binding, but there's nothing in the new rule on Title IX that prevents schools from following that guidance that protects the rights of trans and gender nonconforming students. So student organizers can and should push their schools to commit to following that 2016 guidance that was rescinded. Okay, and fourth loophole and final loophole for this part is the preponderance of the evidence standard. So Maha already explained that there are 2 different standards schools can use, and just to further explain, clear and convincing is just a much higher standard to meet than preponderance of the evidence. Because as Maha said, preponderance simply means that harassment, violence is more likely to have occurred than not. And the reason preponderance is so important to use in sexual harassment cases is because it's the only standard that values the educational access of the complainant, so the survivor, equally with the educational access of the respondent or the perpetrator. So the new rule says that schools can choose which standard to use between preponderance and clear and convincing. And then once they choose a standard, they do legally need to stick with that standard across all cases. So student organizers should push their school to choose the preponderance of the evidence standard. And just another quick note on that, there are some instances in which a school might have a collective bargaining agreement that requires it to use the clear and convincing standard for employee sexual misconduct investigations, and thus is required under the new rule to also use that clear and convincing standard for student sexual harassment investigations as well. And in those cases, the school should work cooperatively with its employee unions to renegotiate the standard of proof used in employee sexual harassment investigations. These are some of the most important loopholes with the new rule that you can organize around. And if you want a full list, you can find that, as well as a template for a petition you can use for campus organizing and a bunch of other resources on Know Your Nine's website. And now I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth to talk more about some other best practices for schools.
Now we're going to talk about what schools can do outside of Title IX investigations and investigations generally to support survivors. Number one, provide comprehensive sex ed. Sexual health education is one of the most effective tools for preventing sexual harassment. Research has shown that providing sexual health education for K-12 students makes it less likely that a student will be a victim or a perpetrator of sexual harassment, which includes sexual violence as well as dating violence. And this starts with teaching young children about things like good touch, bad touch, and always asking for consent, even in non-sexual activity, like before giving somebody a hug. So K-12 students should actively push their schools to provide for sexual health education in every grade level. And this content should include consent, healthy relationships, dating violence, child sexual abuse, and reproductive health and decision-making. All of this curriculum should be medically accurate. It should be age appropriate for different grade levels, responsive to different cultures, trauma-informed, and of course, affirming of LGBTQIA people. Number two, students should push their schools to train all staff members on sexual harassment. Students need to make sure that all staff understand how to recognize sexual harassment, which includes child sexual abuse, how to find the school's Title IX office and the Title IX policy, as well as maybe the other types of sexual misconduct policies that a school might have that Nina mentioned earlier. Staff should be trained on the difference between Title IX obligations and criminal law obligations, like reporting child sexual abuse. And staff need to know how to provide effective supportive measures. That means teachers need to understand how they can give, for example, a hall pass when a survivor needs to go to their guidance counselor's office. Teachers need to understand why it's important to give an extension on an assignment, or to let a survivor, for example, retake a test because they were sitting next to their assailant during the exam and did not score very well because of that. Staff should also be very trained on how to recognize and avoid relying on rape myths. Rape myths and other stereotypes that label certain types of students as more promiscuous, more aggressive, less credible, or less deserving of protection. And by certain groups of students, I'm referring especially to girls of color, especially Black girls, pregnant or parenting students, LGBTQIA students, and students with disabilities. Number three, removing police from schools. So we want to be very clear here. Police do not make schools safer. There is a very long history of police violence towards students and communities of color. Students of color, especially Black and Indigenous students, are also more likely to be arrested by school police. They're not safer. They are put in more harm when there are police in schools. It's also important to understand that police are often the people who are also sexually harassing and assaulting students. Many of you may know, especially from the recent uprisings against police violence, that sexual misconduct is the second most common type of police misconduct. That same risk of sexual misconduct by police exists in our schools. For example, we at the National Women's Law Center have heard from many students about school police officers, quote, dating teenage girls in middle and high schools, and particularly targeting girls of color. This is child sexual abuse. Children absolutely cannot consent to sex with an adult, and certainly not to sex with an adult carrying a weapon. Study after study has shown that having police in schools does not make schools safer, but it does push more students, particularly Black and brown students, out of school and into the criminal legal system. And of course, not to mention, school police are extremely expensive for all of the harm that they cause. This brings us to our next point, number 4, invest in non-police adult helpers in schools. A recent report from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, showed that in K through 12 public schools in this country, we have 1.7 million students who are in schools with school police, but 0 counselors. There are 3 million students in our public school districts who have police, but no nurses. 6 million students in public schools with police, but no school psychologists. 10 million with police, but no social workers. And 14 million students who have school police, but they have no counselor, nurse, psychologist, or social worker. This is absolutely unacceptable. Schools must fund these critical student services, and they can do so by reallocating the money that is saved when they remove cops from schools. We do want to stress, of course, that this is not a simple solution. Counselors, nurses, social workers cannot serve as proxies for the police. And this has been true historically in many communities. Adult helpers in schools are often predominantly white, and many times they can reinforce harmful ideas about students of color, as well as about students who are LGBTQ, pregnant or parenting, disabled, and or poor. So it is very important for schools to hire these staff who are diverse and who are also well-trained to support all types of students, not just upper middle class, white, cisgender, heterosexual, abled students. Number 5, abolish dress codes. This is more of a K-12 issue, but it also affects some colleges and universities too. And it might sound a little extreme, but stick with us. So very simply, dress codes promote rape culture and they deprive students of equal opportunities to learn. Dress codes are often very sexist and racist on their face. And by that, I mean they often target clothing and hairstyles that are worn by girls and by students of color, especially Black and or Muslim students. Dress codes are also often enforced in a discriminatory manner, which means schools are more likely to send somebody to the principal's office for a dress code violation when that student is a girl or is Black or brown, transgender or gender nonconforming, or curvy or fat. Then when the student is a boy or is white, cisgender, and or thin. And that is the case even when 2 students are wearing the exact same outfit or hairstyle. One of them is more likely to be dress coded than the other. Now, the problem is when schools remove students, usually girls, from the classroom over a dress code violation, what they're doing is they're sending a very dangerous message to all students, not just the person who's dress coded, but to everybody who's watching that person be pulled out of the classroom. They're sending the message that what girls look like is more important than what they think, that girls are responsible for, quote, not distracting boys, and that girls are somehow the cause of their own sexual harassment, which of course we know is not the case. And these harmful messages are, again, exacerbated for girls of color, especially Black girls, who are more likely to be seen as promiscuous and sexual, and therefore more likely to be ignored or punished when they report sexual harassment. And we'll talk more about that in a second too. So for all of the reasons that I've just named here, and as well as many more, we encourage students to push their schools to abolish dress codes. The National Women's Law Center has a great dress code report that helps students do this. There are recommendations, there are stories from students, and it also includes some helpful tips. So for example, if a school thinks that abolishing dress codes is too extreme, which by the way it's not, but if they think that, then at the very, very least, the school should still adopt an inclusive and gender neutral dress code, which means that's a dress code that applies to everybody equally and does not treat any student differently based on their gender or their race, etc. Number 6, collect climate survey data. So when we say climate survey here, what we're talking about is a school climate survey. This is a tool for understanding whether students feel supported and safe in their school community. An effective school climate survey about sexual harassment should include questions about how often different types of sexual harassment occur, the effect of that harassment on students' ability to go to school and to learn, to feel safe, what students think about sexual harassment, whose fault is it, who's doing it, and whether students and staff members think the school is responding to sexual harassment in an effective way. And of course, students and staff may have very different opinions about whether or not the school is doing a good job. Schools should ensure that these climate surveys are confidential, that they are scientifically valid, so they should be working with a service provider that is used to collecting data in a scientifically valid way. And these climate surveys should be conducted at least once every 2 years. And after conducting a survey, schools should make this data available online in an accessible and a usable format so that all students and families and school staff can see it. And this is important too, because if you are a student advocate, you want to push for this information to be publicly available, and then you want to use the data to push for stronger school programs and policies to prevent the kind of incidents that you see happen in the data, and to push the school to respond to sexual harassment more effectively. Okay, number 7, protect instead of punish students who report sexual harassment. In the news, you often see a lot of focus on the punishment of the people who cause sexual harassment. And sometimes there's a lot of concern about not punishing them and whether or not schools are punishing them unfairly. But what's not being covered, and what we all know, is that schools often punish the people who experience sexual harassment. Schools are often punishing students who are survivors because sometimes the victim broke some other school rule during the incident. So for example, survivors are often punished by schools because it is against the school rule to have consensual sex on campus. Or if it's a religious school, it's against school rules to have sex before marriage. If in many cases, particularly in high schools and middle schools, it's against school rules to be using drugs or to be using alcohol, or if you're underage. And all of these school rules are very harmful when they're used to punish survivors, because many survivors end up not reporting their sexual assault at all so that they can avoid being suspended or expelled. Students should therefore, when you're organizing, you should push your schools to implement what is called an amnesty policy. An amnesty policy makes it so that when a student reports sexual harassment, they are not punished for this other behavior, whether this other behavior is having consensual sex or premarital sex or using drugs or alcohol during the sexual assault. Other types of behavior that should not be punished. Schools should not be punishing students for reasonably defending themselves against a harasser or a rapist. They shouldn't be punishing students for acting out in age-appropriate ways due to the trauma after sexual harassment. Schools should not be punishing students for publicly talking about being sexually harassed or assaulted. This happens a lot. We see this happen a lot. And schools should not be punishing students for missing class after an assault to avoid their assailant or their abuser. A lot of this is just very common sense, but unfortunately, these types of punishment are very common. And at the National Women's Law Center, we do see these fact patterns playing out a lot, and we've actually represented students in litigation in lawsuits because they were punished in these ways. We have also seen schools pressure students who have reported sexual harassment to take time off, to transfer to another school, to enroll in some sort of inferior alternative education program that isolates them from their friends and deprives them of all of the classes they can take. Schools should not do this. These are examples of schools not simply ignoring survivors, but actively punishing them from coming forward and depriving them of equal education, which is, of course, what Title IX was enacted to protect. And finally, schools should not punish students for making a, quote, false accusation, unless the circumstances are truly, truly extraordinary. So, for example, an accusation is not simply, quote, false, just because there is not enough evidence, or because the survivor did not report the incident right away. We know that delayed reporting is very common. An accusation is not false just because the survivor doesn't act like what a, quote, real victim should act like, whether it's because they are not emotional enough or because they are too emotional, or because their grades are still good, because they're working really hard to fight through the trauma of what happened to them. An accusation is not false just because the survivor stayed friends with the person who harmed them, or even continued dating the person who assaulted them. Again, this is very common, and we know that this does not take away from the truth of an experience, whether or not the sexual assault or the harassment actually happened. So to recap that one, don't punish survivors. Don't punish students who report sexual harassment. Number 8, this is our final best practice for this section of the presentation. Offer a restorative process. So restorative justice is a word that you may have heard come up, especially recently. It is a non-punitive framework. It has roots in different indigenous cultures around the world. A restorative justice process brings together the victim and the person who caused the harm to acknowledge the harm that happened, to center the victim's needs, and to create a plan for the wrongdoer to repair the harm they caused. A restorative process is not a space for the parties to fight about the facts. It's not a place for peer conflict resolution or mediation. Though peer conflict resolution and mediation, as my co-panelist explained earlier, requires both of the parties to reach a compromise. And we know that there's no compromise to be reached when one side sexually harassed or sexually assaulted the other side. What a restorative process is it requires the wrongdoer to admit that they caused the harm and allows them to make amends to the victim and to re-enter their shared community. So for example, in a school setting, to re-enter their shared school community and be part of the community again and be trusted by their classmates again. Studies have shown that when a restorative process is done well, victims of sexual harm feel safe, they feel respected, and they would recommend the process to other people. And the students who caused the sexual harm better understand why what they did was wrong. Many schools are already starting to use restorative processes for other types of student misconduct, as well as for sexual misconduct. And so if you're a student organizer, you can push your school to give survivors the option of choosing between a traditional investigation, whether that is a Title IX investigation or a non-Title IX sexual misconduct investigation like the ones that Nina was talking about earlier, or choosing to have a restorative process. Now, the most important thing is that all parties have to consent to a restorative process. And this requires having the respondent, the person who caused the harm, that person cannot consent to a restorative process without admitting that they caused the sexual harm to the complainant. That's very important. The parties also have to agree not to share any information from the restorative process with outsiders. That includes not sharing information with the police or with a prosecutor unless there's another agreement after the fact. The facilitator of the restorative process must, of course, be very well trained, and both parties must have the right to stop the restorative process at any time and start a traditional disciplinary process or investigation. And this is very important because you don't want students to be locked against their will in a restorative process that has gone badly, where, for example, the respondent is uncooperative or makes the survivor feel unsafe or further traumatized. So those are 8 best practices that schools can do outside of an investigation. And we encourage student organizers to push your schools to adopt these practices. And now I will turn it over to my co-panelist, Faith, to discuss how you actually organize.
So Nina and Elizabeth have done a really great job breaking down all the possible areas where schools can implement more survivor supportive policies. And so now I want to dive into how to successfully organize once you've hammered out your demands. So the first thing I recommend is don't recreate the wheel. The first step in organizing is to find out what has already been done or tried. Especially in college, we see this institutional forgetting where every 4 years the student body turns over and organizers end up starting from the beginning again. So do your research to understand the history of Title IX activism on your campus and also explore the existing groups or students that are already doing the work at your school. Our movement actually becomes weaker and we lose power when we redo things that have already been done or when we copy or contradict existing efforts. So you always want to start with examining your history. Then you're going to build a team and coalition. So if you find that in doing your research, there are other groups or students that are already doing that work, that's great. You can reach out to them and ask how you can get involved, how you can plug in. If not, you can start building an organizing team by reaching out to your friends or other students. I often hear people say like they don't know who to reach out to. All you need is like you, a friend or two that cares, and you're good to go. So it's really important to have a small team of people to organize with because A, you don't want all of the work to fall onto you, but also B, it's really, really important to have multiple perspectives and ideas coming together. But also at the same time, you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. So I feel like the sweet spot tends to be 3 to 5 people as kind of your core organizing group. And then another really crucial aspect of activism is coalition building. Oppression does not exist in a vacuum, and so our organizing should not exist in a vacuum. You need to share your demands with other student groups, such as those advocating for racial justice or climate justice, and ask them for feedback. Do they support the demands? Do they have any concerns, especially about unintentional harm that may occur as a result of a demand? Do they have other demands that can be lifted up and included? So determine how your groups can work together to achieve the changes you all seek. That's the best way to move in coalition with each other. Next, you're going to determine your specific targets. So it matters who you target with your demands. Without a specific target, so if you just target the University of Michigan, schools have the ability to shirk responsibility for responding to your demands. And if you target the wrong person, your campaign will lose credibility. So you need to work with your team to determine a few things. Who has the power to make the changes you seek? Whether or not those people who have the power are an ally to your cause or not. How those policy decisions are made. So whether they have to be approved by the board or go through start from a task force, what that legal process looks like, all of that bureaucracy aspect of organizing. And then you want to know when policy decisions are made. Are they made over the summer? Do they review policies? Do they review them regularly at board meetings? Do concerns have to be brought up before policies are kind of reconsidered? Those are all things you want to figure out. And then additionally, you can also explore who has the power to influence the decision makers. So those would be your secondary targets, and those are people that you can use to help get your decision makers to do what you want. So to do that, we need to use inside and outside organizing. Once your team is built and your demands are written and your targets are identified, it's time to take action. And we split our action into two categories: inside organizing and outside organizing. Inside organizing means working within the system to achieve the change you want. So that could look like setting up a meeting with the decision makers, whether that's the president of your school or the Title IX coordinator, or you could utilize student government to kind of create change that way through pushing your demands. And outside organizing works outside the system to apply pressure. So that can include protests and sit-ins and strikes, utilizing the press, and organizing alums and donors and things like that. So whether you organize from the inside or the outside will just depend on your personal style and your school's unique climate. But the most effective way to organize is by utilizing both inside and outside tactics. And figuring out where folks feel comfortable organizing is another thing that you can focus on when you're building out your team in the first place. So for me in undergrad, I really didn't get along with my administrators very well. They didn't like me. I was much more comfortable doing outside organizing and applying pressure that way. Now I'm in grad school and they sort of like me, I guess. And I've been able to just have really productive meetings one-on-one with the Title IX coordinator. So now in grad school, I'm doing a little bit more of inside organizing. Undergrad, I did more outside organizing. But again, you really need both to achieve your goals. And then lastly, you want to focus on what motivates the school. So schools are businesses and they're motivated to act on the things that influence their business. Oftentimes what's in the school's best interest, like not being known as a school with a rape problem, is in contradiction to what's in a student's best interest, like having sexual violence adequately addressed. So when planning what tactics you'll use to get your demands met, you want to focus on the three things that motivate schools the most: reputation, money, and matriculation. So schools are terrified of bad press, often because it impacts money and matriculation. So going to the media to air out the school's dirty laundry can be hugely effective. I did that a lot in undergrad, which is why they didn't like me. So reach out to student newspapers, local media, let them know what your school is doing wrong, what you're demanding, and why it matters. The why it matters is really, really important because bad press is often the quickest way to get your school to act, and they're not going to write any kind of story on you if they don't think it matters. To influence profits, you can turn to large donors and alums and ask them to commit to not donating until your demands are met. So you want to make sure here that people aren't just not giving money, but are also explicitly explaining why they won't donate and under what conditions their donations would resume. So that will make it completely clear to the school that the lack of donations they're receiving is 100% tied to their lack of survivor supportive policies. So if you're getting a text or a call from some poor undergrad student working to get money from you and you say, I'm not donating until the school meets these demands, that student hears that a bunch of different times, they're going to end up going and saying, hey, this is what we're hearing. This is why people aren't donating. So that's really, really important. And then finally, you can also utilize current students and prospective students by having them commit to either not returning to school or not enrolling in the first place until your demands are met. So it's obviously super important that prospective students are aware of their school's faults, and schools care what prospective students think because this influences their reputation, money, and matriculation. So you can also consider planning actions around campus tours or other prospective student events I've seen a lot of quick change happen when students start passing out cards to touring families with details of how the school fails to respond to how the school fails to respond adequately to sexual violence and sexual harassment. It's obviously a little bit more difficult when a lot of us aren't on campus because of COVID, but there will still be online virtual events for prospective students, and you can definitely make your voice heard there. So those are my recommendations for best practices, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth.
And want to give a special shout out to students in the audience. We are here, all of us, as resources to support you as you organize to advocate for better policies at your school. We cannot emphasize enough how important it is to hear student and survivor voices in this fight. You are the experts of your experiences, and you have the solutions that are necessary to make a change in this fight. And so we want to be there for you. So thank you again so much for joining us. Take care.
Immediate justice.
My body is a flower, a fragile quality of beauty and potential. It's a canvas of childhood memories. The brushes stroke and cut deep, and escape through a school of fish. I am an old jailer, restricted from everything. I am reclaiming this broken territory. My body is a site of strength and power. Set me free.
There's an old story about healing, that it can only happen one way, that there's a way to get it wrong, that it's got a clear beginning, middle, and end, that it happens in a straight line, that it's passive, and that it has to happen alone. This story can make it feel like healing is too hard, like healing is possible for other people, but not for us. We're here to tell you that that story is not true. Here's what's true. Healing is possible for everyone. It is for you. Healing is the opposite of passive. It's action. It's a journey. And the Me Too movement is honored to support you in that journey, because the Me Too movement has always been about healing and action. That's why we've created an online platform for original content, with a database of hundreds of local and national resources to support you at any point in your journey. Whether you're looking for guided healing or you're ready to take action. Whether you're supporting a survivor or trying to find your place in the movement, this is a place for all survivors and allies. What's most important is that while this movement is here to help, healing is your power, and the journey is yours to define. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the noise, this is a movement of people learning, healing, and changing. We see you, we hear you, we're here too.
Thank you for joining our Survivor Summit. My name is Joanne Smith, and I'm the founder of Girls for Gender Equity, where we believe that a vision for gender and racial equity means ending gender-based violence. Together, we are more than survivors, advocates, and voters. We're decision makers, leaders, and experts who believe that healing is lifelong and takes a village. Invite a loved one, a young person, to join us today, because in the words of great poet Gwendolyn Brooks, we are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond.
Take a deep breath to get grounded. Look for 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 good thing about yourself. Now take 1 last breath.
chair. I am wearing a short sleeve black shirt with silver hoop earrings. I have on small rectangular glasses, a dark purple reddish lipstick, and my long dark hair is hanging down my back. It is my honor to introduce you to our speakers for the day, starting with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Coakley. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a little person. You can't tell that because I'm just sitting down. But I have shoulder length red hair with a lot of gray because I haven't been able to get my hair dyed since COVID. I'm wearing a sort of like brickish red / brown lipstick, wearing a black blazer and a green top, sitting in front of a green wall with a map from Middle Earth. I had to check which nerdy map I was in front of. And it is a pleasure to be here today with all of you.
Hey, I'll go for it. My name is Leah Lakshmi Piepshnasamrasinghe. I use she and they pronouns. I am yet another autistic non-binary femme in their 40s. I have more gray hair than Rebecca. I look like an aging, middle-aged, mixed-race Sri Lankan Roma punk. I've got brown and gray curly hair on one side. These amazing spoon witch earrings where if you are low on spoons and you need one, you can get these from, oh shit, my friend Lex on Script is Etsy, which I'm blanking on right now. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt that has my favorite comic, SFSX. That's about a bunch of sex workers that fight back against patriarchal Christianity, and hot pink lipstick. I'm really glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Leslie Templeton. I'm with the Women's March and their disability coordinator. I do a lot of work around sexual assault and disability, and also just disability in general. I'm really happy to be here. I am a ginger red hair down to about midway through my back. I'm wearing a shoulderless blue dress in front of a dresser and a blue wall.
Right, I thought we'd just dive right in with our first question. Given that trauma is a disability, whether it's mental or physical, why should organizations that do work in the space of violence include a disability justice lens as part of their day-to-day business?
Can I go?
Go ahead,
Okay.
Go for it.
So for some people who may be new to the definition and history of disability justice, I want to start out by saying it was created by disabled Black, Asian, or white, queer and trans folks who were revolutionaries who had a radical intersectional analysis of disability. So for me, when I hear, when I hear that question, I'm like, well, if we bring a disability justice lens into doing sexual assault and IPV work, it means looking at the sexual assaults of disabled Black and brown folks in prison, in institutions, in psych wards. It means lifting up the knowledge and leadership of the many, many, many disabled sex workers who are out there who are being slaughtered by Sesta Fosta. It means listening to the voice of disabled trafficking survivors, and looking at how the trafficking movement is really taking a lot of money and not actually centering a lot of trafficking survivors. And to me, I also just want to say, because I've written about this, there's a lot of ableism in the ways in which healing is defined traditionally in a lot of traditional survivor services. I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual assault, and even going to progressive feminist POC therapists, there was this idea of like, ooh, rape breaks you and then you're fixed. And as disabled people, we actually know, Eli Clare, for one, has written really eloquently as a disabled white trans survivor about actually being like, screw cure. For a lot of people who are survivors, I'm like, oh, so you're neurodiverse now. So it doesn't mean that someday you're going to get back to normal and that's what being cured is. It means that actually disabled people and disability justice has a lot to teach you about the wisdom and the disabled life hacks of living with PTSD and complex trauma. So you don't have to go back to normie, never raped to be able to be a really beautiful, fierce survivor with an amazing life. That's my short version.
That's a great start, Leah. Look, I feel like you said everything that needed to be said. But
Sorry, I was just like, I'm gonna go first.
No,
Wait,
you was on a roll.
Somebody
No,
go.
that was beautifully said. You was on a roll.
Leslie, Rebecca, what you got?
You've said it all. I mean, I think it's really important to talk about, like you even brought up intersectionality around sexual assault and disability. I think a lot of the times when we think of disability, and even in terms of sexual assault, we think of this monolith. A lot of times we think of a white woman. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And we don't understand that because of multi-marginalizations, sexual trauma can look different to everyone and how it impacts them. I mean, even access to resources, even accessibility in certain areas, trying to get sexual assault resources in lower income areas may be different than trying to get access to resources in the higher income areas that are accessible. I think that when we talk about sexual assault, sexual violence with the disability community, we also always talk about how you can become disabled from it, but also you can be disabled before, and how that impacts your disability. I know that after mine, I had an increased seizures, and there was no real resources to understand, like, my mental health, my physical health is getting worse now. And so, yeah, I think that's like some of the most important things when we're talking about disability and sexual violence with organizations.
You know, I think in my perspective, this is Rebecca, one of the things that I continue to find myself thinking about is a lot of times where we face assault, where we face violence might be within our own subsection of the disability community. Yeah. And then when we come home, whether it be something that, and it's been something I've heard universally, being a little person, our conferences are epic. Our conferences are looked at from other folks in other parts of the disability community. It was like, oh, I heard those little people conventions are bananas. You know, I've also heard similar things in the blind community, and I've heard things in the neurodiverse community where everybody knows who the abusers are. Everybody knows who's the problematic person, but because there is not language, there is not interest in addressing those issues within the smaller segments of the disability community. When that survivor comes home or is in a place where they can actually access services, it's external to that community. And so there isn't that context, there isn't that ability for recognition of the trauma that we experience a lot of times at the hands of our peers, at the hands of the people that we should be able to look to for peer support and for acceptance. And just the need for outside organizations to realize that this is both sort of an inside and an outside thing, and that there is the need for the knowledge translation across a lot of those spaces, and also the belief and the trust that we are the experts of our own experience. I mean, I've had friends tell me that, you know, coming back from a conference after being assaulted, they went to their campus provider and they're like, oh, I'm sure you just misunderstood it. Or, you know, maybe they're just really lonely because there's nobody else like them. And so you guys get together for a week, and like, no, that's not okay. It's never okay. No. And actually creating those expectations in the non-disabled community when disabled people sharing their self-experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to add,
go ahead.
You know, I want to add here, this is by Alyssa, as a social worker, just the professional lens of the fact that this isn't discussed in our professions, whether it's in our trainings and our programs to the conferences that we go to. Rarely do we hear about disability justice and violence, domestic, intimate partner, you know, doesn't really matter, you know, and I really feel like that gap is why organizations don't have that lens, why a lot of practitioners do not know how to engage with disabled people from a lens that is more appropriate to us, that doesn't lean into the medical model, doesn't lean into the trauma, doesn't lead into just centering the disability only and not looking at us through a holistic, full lens. So that gap starts, you know, on the professional end as to why organizations and those within them have this severe, you know, incapability of understanding disability in general, much less disability justice.
Yeah, if I can add one thing, is that okay? I just was going to say that, you know, we're talking about disability justice, and, you know, Vilissa, what you were just saying, I mean, I worked in mainstream Great Crisis for 10 years. I mean, we were a very women of color, queer, anti-racist hotline, and we had some disability awareness, but we were still up a flight of stairs. We still had like the whole staff being like, oh, there's a TTY, but we don't know how it works. And, and it's 20 years later and a lot of services are still there. They're like, and they're still saying they're like, oh, well, we're in an old Victorian, sorry, there's no money to renovate. Just real basic access stuff.
Right.
And then you've got the stuff where, Rebecca, when you were talking, I was like, right, like most of abled world, they still don't get that disabled people have communities like that we hang out, right? Like, so that small community thing is so huge. And we as disabled people know our communities are so precious and are our life support. And we actually, whether or not we believe in transformative justice, often we're like, I don't want to throw that person in jail. I don't want to throw another disabled person, under the bus, but I need sexual assault to stop happening. And then you're in this tiny little community where people are real independent. It's real hard. And then on top of it all, going back to abled world, you've still got people, including mainstream non-disabled providers, falling into the dichotomy that's so old and tired of, oh, disabled people, oh, you have sex, like not believing that disabled people have agency or sexuality. And on the other hand, seeing some of us as hypersexual super predators. And in the middle, it's the stuff that I think we've all been touching on about, oh, did you make that up? We're like, one of the ways ableism comes in is competency, right? Which specifically affects people with mental health, neurodivergent, and psychiatric disabilities, but also hits disabled people across the board of like, oh, you're some cripple. You must not know what rape is, Right. And then specifically, sorry, last thing. I mean, I just want to give a shout out to, so many autistic activists have spoken about the specific effect to lift up applied behavioral analysis as being a treatment that literally teaches autistic kids to not believe our own understandings of what's happening, which then raises us as neuroweird kids to be like, oh, well, I can't trust myself. That didn't feel good. But no, I have to listen to what normie guy is saying over there. So we're like ABA is basically medical gaslighting mixed in with electroshocks. And, for a lot of parents of autistic kids, they're still being told, oh, this is the creme de la creme of the treatment for your kid. So, yeah, I mean, I'll just stop there. But these are all the things, these are some of all the things that we in the movement have to be dealing with.
Yeah, it is. So I thought we could continue to dive in, go to our next question, which is, what are the gaps in services? I know we kind of went over this a little bit, that impact disabled people structurally and programmatically within the domestic violence space.
I think it's even just the conversation that domestic violence is an issue for disabled people.
Right.
I mean, I think just as Leah pointed out, how people are shocked that disabled people have sex. People are equally shocked when they meet a disabled person in a relationship. I mean, I remember when my partner and I first started dating, and I took him to a conference that I was speaking at in Orlando with all these young people. And all these young people pulled me aside and were like, you have a boyfriend? Like, oh my God, how did you meet him? And we ended up in this long conversation because they had never seen a disabled person in a relationship before. They didn't know it was a thing, or it could be a thing. And actually having that conversation with them. And then I realized as a young elder to them, I had a responsibility to talk to them about healthy relationships, because all these, several of these young women were like, oh, well, if you can, I'm going to go get a boyfriend and I'm just going to date this other guy in the group who might be a total asshole and might be really mean, but it's okay because I have a boyfriend. And I remember sitting a bunch of them down and being like, that's not okay. That's not how this all works. But realizing that for them, they had been told even by their parents, one of them, I remember even working at, one of the big warehouses for Walgreens, and thankfully they're not there anymore. But the CEO of Walgreens, publicly saying, disabled people don't have friends. Disabled people don't have relationships. And that's why I'm doing this charity. And she and her family had totally internalized this message. And so when she was ready to leave this relationship and get assistance, they were like, but, I think he really does love you. I think maybe it's a disability thing. And that being the response from the IPV space, instead of centering her experiences, they were separating her from the disability piece and viewing the disability as reasoning as justification for the violence.
Yeah, absolutely. I just talked a lot. Leslie, do you want to go?
Sure. Well, what I wanted to bring up too is that accessibility in these spaces is really a big issue. I mean, accessibility, ASL interpreters, making websites accessible for people who are blind or have visual disabilities. All these things create barriers to people getting the help they need. And I think that's part of the reason why sexual violence and domestic violence is so high within the disability community, with us being survivors and everything. It's because there aren't a lot of resources that are made to make sure that we have complete access to them. It's really hard to find resources that you can find accessible, even resources that we see on the internet. They don't always have trigger warnings. They could be triggering. And then also when we talk about disability, a lot of the times when you are neurodivergent, you may be able passing. And so a lot of the times when you're in these organizations, getting the help you need can be an extra barrier, trying to explain, I also have this and this is what I need. And proving that you do have this greater need and need to talk to someone about having a disability and having this kind of trauma, and how trauma can impact that disability, and how they're bidirectional with each other.
Yeah, and I think for me as a social worker, just looking at our programs, having a background in psychology and social work, I heard nothing about the disability-specific issues of domestic violence or sexual violence until I became an activist. And that's very troubling, to where we have professionals in these fields that don't know what to look for that's disability-specific, when it comes to intimidation, when it comes to medical abuse, people withholding things, withholding medical equipment, medical supplies from us, financial abuse of disabled people, the things where it doesn't leave bruises, physical bruises, that people are not aware of to ask these questions, or even it stems from, us not learning about these things in schools. How many of us haven't had sex education through K through 12 to learn about consent, to learn about good touch, bad touch, to learn about what abuse is, or anything like that. So a lot of, professionals, whether it's educators, social workers like myself, have failed disabled people in providing information, providing that support, and then coming into the worlds that we are in and ensuring that the materials are accessible, making sure that they're disability specific, making sure that materials are available in Braille and large print, making sure that our facilities are not just visually accessible, but accessible in other ways, a little bit what Leah had touched on earlier. So there's a lot of the structural and programmatic things that are really lacking that causes more harm for us outside of the actual harm that we're enduring every day.
I just want to add a couple things, like just kind of jumping back to what Rebecca was saying about, like, a lot of disabled young people still being like, oh shit, you can date. I think that on the flip side, I think with providers, there's that, and there's also a lack of understanding that as disabled people, we have relationships in different ways, right? So a lot of us may have really intimate relationships that aren't necessarily sexual. Some of us are asexual. So, but then, in the traditional mindset, it's like, oh no, it's your boyfriend or your girlfriend. That's who you're looking at. And then if you go, no, we don't fuck, but this is in like an abled neurotypical way, but this is my person. And they're also my caregiver who I trust with things I don't trust other people with, maybe, and it's starting to go sour because there's a real power imbalance there. That's something that's not even on the radar of so many providers. And then you've got honestly, often the kind of provider, well, why don't you just leave? And a complete lack of understanding of, I've talked to so many people who are like, I would move out, but it took us a year to find this accessible apartment. Right. And like, do you have another one that you can just dial up for me? Is it on Section 8? Like, really understanding that. And then you've got these providers like, oh, sorry. Yeah, well, I hear there's a waiting list. And you're just like, just shoot me. Right. I also just really want to shout out, I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing about both desirability and how it intersects with ableism, because that's a huge thing. I mean, there's the element of, oh, I didn't know we could date, but there's also the element of, just so much internalized ableism of like, if someone will date you, you better just stick with them and be real grateful because there might not be anybody else. And the way that's in, like, we talk about structural changes. I'm like, right. So how many times have people been on Tinder and an online site? And maybe it doesn't say chicks and chairs are gross. Maybe it does. But it also will say things like, oh, no baggage, right? Which is just code for don't be neurodiverse, don't have a mental health disability, right? And so many disabled people I know have stayed in relationships that got abusive way too long, both because of that feeling of like, there's not going to be anybody else. And maybe I depend on my partner for care, but also for intimacy, for love, for all the things. And then I just want to say, like, there's ways that internalized ableism gets in us where we're not aware, like the stuff that Alyssa was talking about, we're not even aware, oh, that's abuse. Like, I had a partner, you know, almost 20 years ago now, who I was like, great, she's not physically abusive, this is cool. But she was very, you know, able-bodied, tough, you know, you just power through it. Really had a thing where she would minimize my disabilities and my chronic illness as like that some bougie stuff. And, you know, I didn't have language for when I slipped and fell in the shower and I was like, I need a shower chair. And she laughed at me. Like 10 years later, when I was in disability justice community, I was like, oh, that's abuse, right? That was her minimizing my disability. That was her mocking me for having an access need. You know, that was her using emotional manipulation to make me feel bad for having that. But if you'd asked me then, I would have been like, oh no, it's just, things are hard, but I don't know, I guess it's just me, right? I am weak. And if you don't have language to identify, you know, specific abusive dynamics that are tied with ableism, it's going to take you a longer time to get out of the relationship or the situation. And then when, you know, Ye Olde Rape Crisis Center doesn't have that in their wheelhouse either, you're pretty much shit out of luck.
Well, and I think I want to, can I add on to what?
Yeah.
Can I add on to what Leah was saying? Because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially now that I'm a mom and I have 3 kids. I'm on all these listservs for parents of kids with disabilities, predominantly parents of kids that are little people. And I've had to push back a lot because I watch the amount of information these parents put out there about their children and like these graphic photographs that parents will put out for the sake of educating each other. And it's triggering as hell for a lot of us that are little people that are watching this that are like, what the hell are you doing? Don't put this up. Like, what? This is the internet. This is Facebook. This is going to be here for forever. And then we end up getting pushback and hate on that. But also the role that family and the medical profession plays in divorcing you from your body as a disabled person. You know, and I think it was really interesting when you heard the abuse case of the Olympic gymnast talking about how they felt divorced from their bodies, like because of their body being commodified in the work that they do. And I think a lot of times as disabled people, because of the medical industrial complex, because of ableism, like we've been taught like, oh, any able-bodied person has a right to see your body, has a right to point out things on your body. If they're a doctor, if they're a social worker, like make your, and also the conflict of having to make your story as traumatic as possible in certain cases in order to get the benefits you might need in order to survive.
Right.
For a lot of people, and how that plays out in abuse and interpersonal violence, where it's like, I've talked to people and they're like, oh yeah, no, like, wait, I can say no if somebody touches me.
Yeah.
I've never been told that I could say no, or I've never been told that what the doctor is doing is actually abuse. Like I've always been told that the doctor is the expert by my family, by society, and like, just trust the doctor. And like, I've had to sit there with friends of mine and be like, no, it's not okay. Like you are being abused by your physician who is in a position of power and authority. And you've been conditioned to believe that this behavior is okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the words of the website, Real Social Skills, non-compliance is a social skill. And as disabled folks, as neurodivergent folks, we are taught, I mean, they call it compliance training. Like that's what autistic kids are literally taught. And so, you know, one thing that I want rape crisis and IPV services to get into is like, oh, what do disabled survivors need? Disabled survivors need to be connected with disabled activism and community. That's going to be like, no, you can say no to the doctor. Screw the doctor. You can say no to compliance training. You can learn how to retrust yourself. That's what's going to liberate us.
It is. And that kind of goes into our, you know, next question. What are challenges and barriers that disabled people face in reporting sexual or domestic violence?
I would love to talk about that actually, because there's a lot going on. I mean, we talk about police brutality right now, especially for Black disabled people. It could be hard to go to the police. I mean, we see 30 to 50% of people who are killed by police are disabled. The idea of putting yourself in that situation or calling the police being like, come, there's something going on, you could be directly putting yourself in danger. So it makes it there's that barrier of getting the help that you need in the legal sense. There's also just, again, accessibility. When you're in a relationship, someone could be holding their financial power over you. They could be like, with asset limits, it could be hard to get out of a house and trying to find a new house. All these other things that make it harder for someone. They discourage someone from reporting because it could cause problems with their everyday life and being able to access the things they need. I always say accessibility is part of the reason why we have such high rates of domestic violence, of sexual assault in our communities, because it makes us have to stay in these positions with our caregivers, with people we're in relationships with, the people we rely on every day. And if we need to figure out ways to protect people in our community, and also talk about these issues with reporting.
We do. No, that's a great point, Leslie. And I think another point we need to make that's been touched on is the fear of reporting. Will you be believed? Will someone take your abuse seriously? Particularly with some of the ways in which we can be abused that we went over. Some people not even regard that as abuse. Some people be like, oh, they don't mean that, just diminish it. And also a little bit of education piece that I mentioned earlier, many of us may not know what abuse looks like, because it's been so normalized from us at birth, when it comes to our bodies to adulthood, that we do trivialize it, that we do diminish it, and at times blame ourselves. So there's a lot of victim blaming in first off recognizing abuse and then getting the courage to report it. And then what happens after that? What kind of supports will you receive? A little bit of what was touched on earlier was about the accessibility aspect. Where do you go? Particularly if you're somebody who requires a lot of care. Who's going to manage your care or at least assist you with care? If your abuser is your primary caregiver, who's going to assist you with that? These are a lot of factors in which we have to think about as to how somebody's life can change if they were to report it, and possibly being isolated, not having a lot of community to lean in on as they figure out what that next step looks like.
I think also building off what you said with the community, especially if you're in a relationship with someone else in your community, like Rebecca was even talking about earlier, it could be harder for you to get out because you've built this relationship, this circle of support systems around this relationship. And this person's probably in that circle of support. So it can isolate you. I always say, I never talk about who my abuser was. I never name names because I'm always scared that I'm going to face backlash. Everybody wants to support you when there's no name, but the second you name someone, that can change the entire aspect. You can be villainized, you can be hurt. And then also even going to try to talk to someone about it. I think infantilization of disabilities is a big part of it too. People are like, oh, no one no one hates people with disabilities. No one would do that to a disabled person. People love disabled people, because it's all this whole idea that we should be thankful that people like us. We can't face any discrimination. We can't face anything bad because people love disabled people. They love helping us. It's a whole inspiration point. I think also adds to that because it's the idea that we make everyone feel good. So why would anybody want to make us feel bad or want to hurt us? And that also creates barrier to care and barrier to reporting.
Yeah, I mean, people just think of disabled people as the Smurfs, they're just really real. And I mean, I think that leads into what do we mean when we think about disabled survivors, right? I mean, why does disabled survivors not report? Why does anyone not report? It's kind of so as a survivor, what do you get out of it? Are you going to get a conviction? Do you want a conviction? Are you going to be brutalized and re-traumatized while that happens? When I think about disabled survivors, I think about the fact that a lot of cops are rapists, right? So are we thinking about a lens of disability where it's a white, straight, cis disabled person, right? Or are we thinking about disabled sex workers who are raped by cops on the beat, right? And they're just I'm not going to go to the system. I think about my own experience which is so common and which is a really good example of how ableism is in everything. Where as a young childhood sexual abuse survivor, right? I mean, my parents were you don't tell anyone anything, ... because you're going to be taken to foster care by CPS. And years ago, when I was working for Generation 5, which has now morphed into the Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition, but for years was an organization that was looking at what it would take to end childhood sexual abuse in 5 generations from a transformative justice perspective. The first workshop I ever attended that we did, the facilitator was like, okay, so put up your hand if you're a survivor, or you know someone who is of CSA. Everyone puts their hands up. And then she goes, okay, so who here was helped by CPS? Nobody, right? So that's the thing. I mean, that's why transformative justice is not just this kind of academic, abstract, we hate the cops for no reason thing. It's that people know that CPS takes you out of being raped by your family and puts you into being raped by foster care or an institution. So, for young survivors, they're like, I don't usually really want that. I'm going to stick with the devil I know, or I'm going to run away, or I'm going to disassociate, right?
Right.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
And
on top of, there's no ASL at the precinct usually, or ramp, or, anything. So yeah, I can't, I have a friend who's like, when you literally can't even get in the door, right? Like because of lack of access, there's that too.
I mean, it was funny when I was running the National Council on Disability, as a survivor, I pushed the council to we did a report on campus sexual assault programs.
Right.
And because it was the same time as It's On Us was up and Me Too was blowing up, and like there was such an attention on this issue, and I never saw an explicit DJ lens on any of these things. And so we commissioned a survey of college campuses, of like over 700 college campuses, and looked at what do their campus sexual assault programs have around issues around assault of people with disabilities, like around accommodations, around even language that was disability inclusive. Like, do they have a number to call? Do they have, a TTY, God forbid, or 2 tin cans that are put together if we're going all the way back to when people use TTYs? Do they have a texting hotline? Like what supports are available? How is campus security trained on meeting the needs of students with disabilities? And quite literally, what we found was nothing. Like, I had never had a report in my 5 years at NCD and my 20 plus years of doing this work where literally we put a page in the report that said best practices on campus sexual assault on students with disabilities. This page is intentionally blank. There are none.
Right.
Because we couldn't find it anywhere.
Right.
And because there was nothing. And there was, even in talking to the disability student groups on campus, and saying are y'all engaged? Like, is this, and everybody said this is a problem on our campus, but we don't even know where to start for help because when, we handle it ourselves internally.
Right.
And for a lot of folks, it just meant we suck it up and deal with it.
Right.
Like within and have a talk and, and internalize the ableism, internalize the sexism, internalize the homophobia, etc. Because there were no options. Inclusion was laughable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you brought that up about campus, like sexual assault, domestic violence. Like, I mean, after what happened to me, I was having seizures, and my seizures increased exponentially just because of stress is one of my biggest triggers. I wasn't leaving my room. I probably left my room a handful of times, and trying to explain that to professors, like I'm dealing with not only this trauma, but it's also impacting my health. I had professors telling me that, oh no, you're just lying. You're just trying to get out of things because there's so many things going on at once. Instead of realizing, wow, that stress is actually impacting my physical health too. So there's 2 aspects that are going on. I'm scared to see people. I don't trust the people I see anymore. I'm also dealing with an extreme health issue where I've ended up in the hospital because of it. Mm-hmm. And after that, because of people not understanding, especially on the with professors, like there's one thing on the institutional level, and there's another thing with the interpersonal relationship with professors. They don't understand that, number one, the trauma aspect that can come out of it. And I was a psychology major, so my teachers were psychologists. So the fact that they didn't understand the aspects of trauma and how that impacts your physical health too, and how both of those can cause issues with me getting to class, me handing in work on time. I failed classes. I couldn't get to class. I couldn't understand what was going on. When I was there, I was dissociating. I couldn't remember what day it was or what was going on that day or what I learned that day. I was having seizures all the time. It was unsafe for me to leave my room sometimes. I had to have friends bring me food. And there weren't as much as I had some administrators try to help me, there wasn't a lot of protections in place for that. There were like, well, we can make sometimes that you have absences that are excused, but not every absence was excused. If it wasn't around my physical health, it wasn't excused. And trying to get all my work done in time was ridiculously hard. And it didn't help when I had professors telling me that I'm faking this. I'm looking for attention. I'm trying to come up with good excuses. And having to justify your trauma and your physical health at the same time, and how those are bidirectionally related, is awful. And that happens a lot. I'm not the only one who dealt with that, who was disabled on campus. That is a very common reaction with professors, because professors tend not, I was lucky to have one professor who was very understanding, but I had a lot of professors who weren't. And that's a huge trend on college campuses. Even if the administration is good, even the individual departments or professors can make life tough for people who are going through these experiences.
Right. And should be done on our campuses.
Sorry.
I said, what should be done on our campuses to address this matter for disabled students and the collective student body?
Well, with my experience, one of the things is that when people have mental health problems, a lot of times they're forced off campus. Mm-hmm. Schools don't want to have that liability, so they're forced off campus, and they can be put into situations, again, where they're facing this violence, which I think is really, really problematic. Either they're going to be moving back in with parents, or they're moving back in with an abuser because they're not allowed on campus. Usually they say, like, you have to have a letter from a psychologist or a letter from a doctor, and it has to be over like a year. And so that also creates barriers for people who have been survivors who may not have the money to go get a therapist note, to get a doctor's note. And it makes it harder for survivors to finish college. It also makes it harder for survivors to be safe. Sometimes college campuses are the only place they can go because anywhere else they have is traumatic, could be where their abuser is, or could just be triggering in general. So a lot of the times when you have these mental health problems that come from trauma like this, you don't have anyone, you don't have anywhere to go, and you're forced off campus. So talking to colleges about ending that practice is incredibly important, I personally think. I think that it's one of the worst practices out there, and it's all about, they don't want to have the liability of someone with mental health problems. They're like, well, we don't want to deal with you. You're bringing down our grades. You could hurt yourself, and then we get sued, like all these other things. And so it hurts students. It hurts the people who are going through some of the worst things they could go through.
Can I add one thing?
And college campus having people illness on campus.
Sorry?
Say it again, Rebecca.
I don't know if that was Rebecca.
Go ahead, Leah.
Okay, I was just gonna, Leslie, thank you for everything you just shared.
Yes.
Seriously, and just the two quick things I want to add are, when you were first talking, I was like, right, this is another intersection, because even when you're not a survivor, when you're a disabled person and you're a student, in order to get accommodations, you need to bring your proof, right? And like, that's a huge barrier for so many people who are like, my doctor, I can't get a doctor to take me seriously. Or people I know who have been disabled since birth who are like, you want me to bring proof that I have cerebral palsy? Really? Like, it's not going to change, or stuff like that. So many things. And where there's just a presumption that as disabled people, we're lying, we're cheats, and we're trying to get over. And, it's, so I'm just thinking in terms of how different would it be on campus if we change that from this kind of legalistic framework of you got to prove it, you got to bring, like they literally say you got to bring your proof, to you as a person with a body and a mind know what your needs are, and you get to say what those access needs are, right? And you're not going to be punished for them, and that there's going to be built-in access throughout the campus system, right? Mm-hmm. That's one thing. And then, so I briefly for a year was the director of the D Center, which is the Disabled and Deaf Student Center at University of Washington, Seattle, which at the time was one of 4 student centers in all of the United States by and for disabled students. That wasn't like the Access Center where you go and beg for your accommodations to a bunch of able people, but like a disabled cultural center where people could hang out. And what I also was just thinking is like, what's needed is there needs to be more space buy-in for disabled students to come together. And it's huge because, you know, a lot of disabled students are like, don't call me that. I just want to be normal. And then you've got people who are like, well, I have generalized anxiety, but I don't know if I count, right?
Yeah,
And so
it's the whole thing, like, I have to count.
Like, I mean, I had students be like, am I allowed to step in here without a letter from a doctor? And I was like, yeah, we have a couch, sit down. It's great. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, it's taking me back to something I was thinking about earlier, which is, I think off the thing Rebecca said, which was, I want more like disabled, healthy relationship and healthy sexuality courses. There's some great stuff on disabled sexuality. They're like by the Empowered Fifis, Cripping Up Sex with Eva, Sins Invalid. You know, lots of places are doing that work. Laurie Erickson's been so important. But I also want a place where we can talk about our relationships as disabled people and be like, and, you know, there's a few places, I'm thinking of the Northwest Network was really crucial in Seattle to be a queer and trans sexual violence center that was like, let's talk about what healthy sexuality and healthy relationships look like for us as queer people, because we don't get a chance to learn those skills in a straight world. I think as disabled people, we need a space to be like, hey, I think it's good. Wait, it's getting a little weird. Wait, I need some tools, you know?
Right.
And I think we also need disabled survivor spaces, which offhand, in terms of organized spaces, I can't think of any on campus. The two I'm aware of are San Francisco Women Against Rape and API China, which is an Asian Pacific Islander sexual assault, sexual health center in Seattle. And I think it's really important to note that it's not an accident that those are both rape crisis centers that are led by feminists of color who had some linkages with disability justice organizing, like Sins Invalid co-sponsored that group in the Bay. And we need like 5 million of those because just for us to be able to get in the door. And, you know, now we're all on Zoom, but pre-COVID, those groups were really groundbreaking in that they were like, of course we have ASL, of course we have court, of course you can Zoom in if you're in your bed. We need to just normalize that access. Okay.
Yeah.
I know we have some more questions. I'm going to stop there, but yeah, we need that. We need to be able to come together as disabled people to talk about our survivor issues.
No, I think that, you know, a little bit what everybody has pointed to kind of leads us to our next question is the gaps in data. You know, we understand that disabled people, disabled queer people, you know, are, you know, survivors of this, but the data do not always show that. So what can we do to ensure that we have the numbers, we have the statistics, you know, we have the narratives that paints a more accurate picture of what's going on for this community?
You know, I think part of it is the questions that we ask. I think particularly for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the questions that we ask are often not accessible. And like the places that those questions are asked, I think the fact that a lot of times where disabled people have questions asked of them are doctor's offices. And you might be there with your parent. You might be there with your abuser. I remember I have in addition to my dwarfism, I have a funky cardiac nerve that my cardiologist calls Sarah Palin because it acts up about every 3 years or so. And then we need to zap her. And then she goes away for a few years. And Sarah was acting up. So we were at the hospital. And it was in the middle of the night, and they send a social worker to the hospital room, and my husband is sitting there, and they start asking questions about our relationship and if he's abusive. And hello, like he's not, but if he was, you have just put me in danger by asking this question in front of my abuser.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of things like that where the people whose job it is or who could be in a position to be helpful don't actually think about as Leah hit on earlier, like those power dynamics that are just so entrenched in ableism in our society.
I think on top of that, like if we're talking about these statistics, a lot of the times when we see mainstream organizations working around sexual assault or domestic violence, they look at, again, disability as a monolith. And they ask very generic questions that are just about disability and not about the intersections of disability. You know, how a trans disabled person or a Black trans disabled person experience survivorship is going to be a lot different than a white upper class disabled person. Mm-hmm. And I think that leads to a lot of gaps in data that negatively impact our communities, because I mean, these people are in our communities. If we don't know where there is a big issue, how are we supposed to address it? How are we supposed to come together and figure out solutions? I think that we need to have more mainstream organizations that are trying to include disability, talk about disability as this issue that multi-marginalized people exist in it. It's not just one monolith where we all experience the same things. And that's how we can really help survivors across the disability community.
No, I agree. And I think that it's a real shame that a lot of these organizations do a lot of this research and that gap is still there. And I think it's well overdue to hold them accountable for that gap still existing in 2020 going on 2021, because we do need those numbers to know who in our community are disproportionately impacted and what supports and services can we do better at providing for them, because we don't have the data, that we don't know how to serve, whether you're a practitioner or whether you're an activist. So anyone that's listening to this who work in organizations that do this research, who utilize the research, call out your colleagues or do better yourself in getting this data, because our lives literally depend on it.
I think one thing I would add too, that just to complexify it a little bit, is that, I mean, this is just making me think about how, and the national census that just happened, there wasn't a "are you disabled" question, right? And then I were talking about it with people, and some people were like, but a lot of people are going to be like, well, I don't know if it counts. A lot of people are going to be like, don't call me that word. And a lot of people are going to be like, I don't trust the government having this information about me.
Yeah.
You've also got all of those really important blockages to gathering the data. And, every single time I do a training or organizing, especially in Black and Brown communities, what I always talk about is that it's not as simple. Like, hey, if we're talking about putting in access stuff or asking people their access needs, so many of us have been taught that we need to minimize our disabilities and our access needs to survive. So it's not as simple as being like, let's do a check-in. You have to unpack you actually have to create the conditions where it's safe for people to disclose, right? I mean, that oft-cited UN, what is it, like 20% of the world is disabled or whatever. That's low. I mean, it's probably 60%. And honestly, I don't think I'm being cynical in that if there was an accurate survey of how many disabled people have survived sexual violence, it'd probably be 95%. It really would. And then in asking about sexual assault, I don't know if it would be enough to be like, have you been sexually assaulted? You're going to need to make it accessible to people who are DID disabled, lots of other things. But also it might be like, a lot of people might look at it and be like, well, no. And you'd have to open up and be like, this includes all of these things. Right. This includes medical stripping. This includes that thing that happened with that doctor when you were 3 years old, right? All of that. And I just also want to say, disabled people are speaking up. I meant to say this before about why don't people report? The first thing I thought about is like, well, look at the autistic youth in the Judge Rotenberg Center, right? They're speaking up and they're still getting shocked. So, a lot of disabled people have also looked and been like, when speaking up happens, nothing happens. So, something needs to change in order for it to be worth it for people to speak up.
Well, I think that's such a key point too. I mean, in the willingness, in the need to respect the voices of disabled people and their experience with it. Right. I think you're right with the JRC. I mean, we've heard people speak out in sheltered workshops that are facing abuse.
Right.
I mean, I remember there was the same time that raped at Howard was the trending hashtag here in DC. Right there below it was raped at Gallaudet.
Right.
And it was one of those things where it was like, I remember looking on Twitter and being like, oh, what's trending in DC today? And it's like, raped at Howard. And I go down the hall and I holler at my husband and I was like, your school's trending. And then all my friends that were Gallaudet alum were like, yeah, that's not surprising, right. Because we don't talk about it, in our spaces. I mean, within the Little People community, we have just now started having AA, Alcoholics Anonymous and NA groups at our conferences. And I had said to them, I was like, why don't we have can we set up some time for survivors? And there was this look and they were like, well, what are you talking about? And I was like, assault and abuse survivors. Let's set up a safe space. Let's set up a room. Let's have some folks available. Well, that doesn't happen at conference. And it was like, what conference are you going to? Because the conference I'm going to, that's a thing. But I think it's also, it's centering the voices of the people. It's creating a climate where people feel empowered to do what needs to do what they feel needs to be done in terms of creating spaces for those conversations that are by them and for them. And it's the acknowledgement that, as you all have both pointed out, that what works for white middle class folks, white cisgendered middle class folks, is not necessarily going to be the same supports and services in the same centering space as for Black and brown folks, trans folks, like everybody else in those spaces.
With 5 minutes remaining, or less than 5, what are some final thoughts that we want to share with everyone?
I mean, I would love to talk about institutionalization and domestic violence, sexual assault. And not only when we're talking about like what we think of mental institutions, everything. I'm talking about nursing homes, prisons, all these places we talk about when trauma is a disability. And so these people are being traumatized a lot. And they have these high sexual assault rates, and there isn't any access really to reporting because the people who are controlling them are the abusers. And like they control every aspect of their lives a lot of the time. I think that I would love to see the disability community and the larger community around domestic violence, sexual assault talk about disability institutions and how this institutionalization goes beyond prisons, goes beyond mental institutions, goes beyond psychiatric centers, goes beyond nursing homes, and just all these places that are regulating people's lives make it hard for people to report. I mean, you have an officer in a jail or in a prison sexually assaulting someone. Where are they going to go? Who are they going to turn to? There's that code of silence, like protect each other. And I mean, it's hard for even people to report. It's hard to get the statistics out there because people are scared to say something happened. And I would love to see more work around that.
No, definitely. And I would like to add, when it comes to institutions, our group homes and foster care, which a lot of our kids are in. And that's when they get their first exposure to different types of abuses. Those institutions need to be called out and addressed as well.
Can we also add in the ICE camps, the border camps, where those people are acquiring disabilities minute by minute as a result of trauma and family separation? And nobody's talking about violence happening in those places. No, there's, the disability. It's one of those things that I asked when a few years or 2 summers ago, the summer of ADAPT. And I asked them, I was like, so what is DIA going to do for the kids at the border that are disabled? Like, they're institutionalized. Can they be able to use your DIA to get out of the camps? Like, has there been thinking about that? And what I was told was like, those kids aren't our kids. And I remember just being like, but they are. Those are your kids. Like, it gets the Irish out in me. But it really is one of those things that it's like, anywhere that people are institutionalized, this happens. And within our community, we don't like to talk about that. We'll talk about it in terms of like the traditional, like old school Forest Haven type of institutions, because that's comfortable for folks. But they don't want to talk about prisons. They don't want to talk about psychiatric institutions. They don't want to talk about any other sort of facility.
I just want to maybe end by lifting up the ways that we're resisting, because I think that's really important, because we've talked about a lot of really heavy duty, real stuff. And I just think it's equally important to lift up that, mainstream disability rights isn't looking at rape and ICE camps and all that, but disability justice is.
Right.
So in terms of if people are like, what do we do? I'm like, look up the No Body is Disposable campaign, look up the look up Harriet Tubman Collective, look at Movement for Disabled Black Lives, like look at those groups and support them, bring them into your sexual assault work. I'm part of a roundtable talk on disability justice and abolition that the Abolition and DJ Coalition is doing next Wednesday. Please check it out. It's got Carton ASL. You can Google it. It's on my Facebook. And I also just want to say that like disabled survivors do so much. Like our strength is that we're excluded from systems, but when I think about how people are resisting without reporting, I think about like the zines that disabled survivors have met, spoken word, writing, all the online crypt communities where we find each other, where I've seen people get people out of abusive situations and save each other's lives and be like, I'm going to come over with my van and bring the ramp, I'm going to get you, or I'm going to help. And because we get it. Not only do we know what our needs are, we have the skills that, a mainstream provider might not have around, okay, I'm going to help you hire care attendants who are not your fucked up family or your husband. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be like, that's not right. And I'm going to get where you're coming from, right? That our creativity, the ways that we crypt sexuality, the ways that we are not sexual, the ways that we create access hacks are really, really important. And there are a well of resources to draw on.
And to wrap up, I just want to say for any survivors that are watching, you have a community. Let me say that again. You have a community that's here, that will believe you, that will embrace you, and that will support you. And I think that's it for our panel. Thank you to everyone that's watching. Thank you to Leah, Rebecca, and Leslie, and myself, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder what you think of the Me Too movement, and if you've given any thought to the strategy for women as a group.
Well, I think it's about time. For so long, women were silent, thinking there was nothing you could do about it. But now the law is on the side of women or men who encounter harassment. And that's a good thing.
Hi everyone, my name is Kate Frame Kite and I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence.
And I'm Natalie Mays with Futures Without Violence. Thank you so much for joining us for the second day of the Survivors Agenda Summit.
Today we dug into powerful content throughout our 6 breakout sessions, from harassment in the workplace and school to accountability around culturally specific communities and restorative justice models. Thank you to our panelists for your thoughtful work to bring these topics to us for discussion, and thanks to all of you for committing to do this work in order to create a safer, more equitable future for survivors. Thank you also to the performers and artists who shared their work with us and reminded us of the many powerful ways we have to share our stories. Please remember to take care of yourselves today and throughout the rest of the summit.
Tomorrow is the final day of the Survivors Agenda Summit, starting off with our closing plenary panel, Bringing the Survivors Agenda to Your Community, a rallying cry for 2020 and beyond, which will bring the agenda to life and give us concrete tools to organize around it in our communities. And then we'll dive back into topics that matter most to us through the Find Your Folks and Youth Track breakout sessions, featuring amazing discussions on building powerful movements for survivors, trans and gender nonconforming survivors, Black girl liberation, safekeeping and healing, intergenerational survivor-led organizing, financial security and stability for survivors, sexual violence in the military, liberatory love letters, and online risks, resources, and allyship among youth, which will be followed by our closing ceremonies. Thank you guys so much for attending, and we hope to see you there.